I will begin, if you allow me, not with the sea, but with paper, the kind that carries salt without ever having touched water. A dossier arrived at my desk in Tokyo, thin, a little battered at the corners, the way a travelled envelope acquires a limp. Inside was the name Piscine Molitor Patel, the manifest of the symptom, and a rumour already heavy from retelling. A 16-year-old boy survived weeks in the Pacific, allegedly with a Bengal tiger. I have spent years coaxing sense out of wreckage bolts in neat trays, timetables, witness statements that contradict one another like waves colliding. Yet even a seasoned investigator has a threshold beyond which facts feel stage-lit. Still, I am less given to disbelief than to measurement, so I sharpened a pencil, drew a line in my notebook facts here, fables there, and booked a flight to Canada. The morning I left, Tokyo wore its practical face, vending machines humming, shoes squeaking on station tiles, no one looking larger than their errand. At Haneda, I watched a ground crew worker guide a plane the way a conductor lifts a baton, small gestures calibrating a massive body. Investigating a disaster is a little like that. One directs small questions at a heavy silence and hopes the thing moves. While waiting to board, I reread the ship's last radio nota routine and the weather reports unremarkable. It is unnerving when catastrophe hides in a sky without drama. On the flight, I made a private pact. I would ask every question as if the ocean were listening. The sea much prefers humility to eloquence. You can bring your diagrams and your firm voice. The sea prefers you uncurl your hand and admit you do not know. Somewhere over Alaska, I pictured the boy as a simple variable. Survivor, Indian nationality, adolescent male, possibly dehydrated, traumatized, prone to confabulation. Then another picture arrived uninvited. 2 eyes steady beyond exhaustion, a spine straightened not by denial, but by some private vow. Professionals are not meant to indulge such impressions, but impressions are like the scent of rain, felt before the drop. You may wonder how an engineer of hull failures ends up writing about a face he has not yet seen. This is part of the job's quiet comedy. We search for broken steel and find instead the supple architecture of the human will. Bureaucracy, by contrast, has no patience for will. It wants a so therefore. Hence, I too value that chain, but even a plain chain must be hammered link by link. So I began with the first link, Pondicherry. The file mentioned a zoo run by the Patel family. I made a note to ask about feeding protocols, sedation schedules, the danger radius of a fully grown tiger, because even myths, if they are any good, borrow the posture of practical detail. As the cabin darkened, the aisle lights faint as a string of buoys, I thought of my own son when he was 16, how certainty came to him like afternoon sun, without effort, and how adulthood has taught me the weather turn. I do not share this to shift attention toward myself. I offer it as a small bridge. We listen differently when a story crosses our own small river. If you are hearing this on a quiet evening, you might have a cup of tea. Perhaps it is the sort that tastes slightly of grass, slightly of memory. You might be thinking of a time you were sure of the day, and then the day surprised you. In that small recognition, you and I meet an investigator and a listener, both attending to an unknown ocean. I landed in a country whose winter sharpens outlines. At the hospital, a volunteer held the door and gave me the kind smile reserved for visitors who carry too many papers. A hallway clock ticked with the authority of clocks everywhere, doggedly dividing a time that for some refuses division. I found the ward and announced myself. The nurse, a woman with the calm eyes of those who have seen all manner of arrival, checked a chart and nodded toward a door. She said his English was excellent. She said he had not cried. at least not where nurses could see. I thanked her, which felt like thanking a lighthouse for standing where it must. Inside, the boy sat propped up by pillows that were almost the size of his past. He was thinner than any figure should be when stitched to the word alive. Yet his gaze did not scavenge, it rested. He greeted me with a courtesy that was not performance. It was, I would learn, his way with the world. To arrange it gently, as one folds a shirt before placing it in a drawer. The chart gave his age, his pulse, the scheduled vitamins. The dossier gave the dates. None of them told me how a boy keeps company with horizon and despair and rises still able to greet a stranger as if offering him a chair. We began with the measurable. I confirmed the spelling of his name, which he delivered with a stillness that suggested long practice at preventing mockery from taking root. He told me he preferred pie, and I wrote it carefully, a tidy circle with a walking line through it. I asked for the Tzimtzum's departure details, the port, the weather, the cargo menagerie in crates, documented in the ledger with zoological names that sounded like small poems written by Latin. I asked him whether he understood the weight capacities of lifeboats, the location of emergency packs. Yes, he said, with the kind of yes that does not resist the obvious. Later, I would list the inventories, water rations, solar stills, flares, a gaff, fishing kit, survival manual with its chirpy tone that has comforted and irritated castaways since manuals learned to smile. Only then did I ask about the name, Richard Parker, written in the cargo list. In our trade, names can be worse than footprints. They travel across reports and turn legends when no one asked them to. Pie's mouth, at the corner, lifted. He explained calmly that there had been a clerical mislabeling. Hunter and hunted exchanged. This is the sort of detail that pleases an investigator because it admits human error without grandstanding. It also plants a seed that in this story swaps may occur. Names may stand where they are not meant to stand, and yet the creature remains the creature, whatever we call it. I inquired about prayer. It is not common in my interviews, but the file whispered that faith lived in this boy's day like a column in a temple load-bearing, unadvertised. He nodded and spoke of ritual as if speaking of meals. At morning and evening, he said, the words gave him not an answer, but a step. When I wrote this in my notebook praise, cadence stabilizes mind, I was not converting to his beliefs, I was mapping ballast. A vessel floats not by bravado, but by balance. Perhaps you worry, listener, that I am indulgent with metaphor. Forgive me. An engineer grows metaphors the way barnacles grow on a hull, by contact with depth. The sea teaches through comparisons because direct instruction is not her style. She says, look, the cloud carries your thirst. She says, see, the rope saves or strangles depending on hands. If you have ever stood on a platform and watched a train pull away without you, you may possess a small replica of what I felt reading the weather log of the Tzimtzum, the ordinariness of the last moment before the gap opens. Let me add something ordinary to loosen the thread. In the hospital cafeteria, I bought a coffee from a machine that spoke in 2 languages, and neither of them kindly to the beans. A man at the next table read a paperback detective novel and underlined nothing. A child pressed her nose to a vending machine glass and decided, after deliberation, on a chocolate bar that would later stick to her sleeve like a medal. We carry on. Coffee, paperbacks, candy. Meanwhile, somewhere a boy arranges his breaths into hours. Back in the room, I asked Pi to begin from the ground, his phrase. He did not perform heroics. He remembered Pondicherry Zoo, his father's lessons about territoriality, the caution that anthropomorphism is a kind of theft. Animals are not your mirror, his father had said. Pi relayed this without spite, as one cites a useful theorem. He remembered the ship's corridors, the smell of metal warmed by engines, the texture of rain on deck shoes. These were details I could follow a breadcrumb trail laid by competence and patience. Piece by piece, he built a scaffolding upon which the later astonishments might conceivably stand. And yet, because every honest report makes room for a small draught of doubt, we must ask ourselves whether balance can be maintained when terror takes the stage. But we still wonder whether truth in extreme conditions must look ordinary to count. The file wants a yes or no, the ocean wants better questions. If you have ever watched a storm from your balcony and found that the potted plant did not collapse though it seemed it must, then you know a little of my position. I was prepared to test the pot, the soil, the wind, everything but the plant's stubborn green. Sitting across from Pi, I began to suspect that stubborn green could be a method, not a miracle. This, then, is my invitation to you as we proceed. Let us carry both lamp and notebook. We will not insult the sea by insisting she be a spreadsheet, nor will we insult the spreadsheet by replacing columns with incense. Between the two is a boy who lived. Between the boy and the forms is a space where the human voice must decide what to keep. In that space, I will do my work. In that space, perhaps, you will do yours. On the second morning, I brought a fresh pad of graph paper, as if the squares could steady whatever would spill from memory. Pi smiled at the sight of it. You like order, he said, not a question. I replied that order is not the same thing as control. Order is the modest hope that a line might hold long enough for a thought to cross. He nodded, as if I had admitted that I too required rails to walk. We agreed to begin not with catastrophe, which tends to overfill a cup, but with the kind of water a person drinks every day. Pondicherry. A boy named after a swimming pool in Paris, Piscine Molitor. A rectangle of sunlit water he had never seen. He explained how the name, lovely in French, curdled on his classmates' tongues into a taunt, and how he solved it by drawing P on the board again and again, becoming Pi by a stubborn arithmetic of self-definition. Names are rafts, he said lightly. I asked permission to write that in my notes. He laughed and said, as long as you don't claim the ocean invented it. I asked about the zoo, and here his voice shifted into a register I recognized in engineers when they speak of a machine they love. He described territoriality not as aggression, but as a map an animal draws to feel safe. He named enclosures by memory spacing, trench depth, climbing hazards like a careful docent. He told me how visitors misunderstand bars and moats, thinking captivity is a universal language, when the animal often prefers the certainty of a defined space to the hazard of a boundless one. It's not jail, he said. It's a room with rules. People forget that rooms make us gentle. He smiled at his own paradox. I wrote, boy understands safety as form. I asked about his father's lessons. He paused, then recounted one. A demonstration meant to impress upon children that a tiger is not a plush emblem of courage, but a being with a separate will. He did not describe anything vivid. He did not need to. The lesson, he said, was that anthropomorphism is a theft stealing an animal's otherness to flatter ourselves. He offered no theatrics, only the moral. Respect begins where projection ends. I thanked him for the phrasing, as one thanks a craftsman for a tool that fits the hand. His faiths, plural, came next because I was trying to understand the ballast of his days. He spoke of Hindu gods as relatives one knows by stories, of Christ whose love sounded to him like someone sitting beside you when you are tired, of the call to prayer that ordered the afternoons like a metronome. I am not a theologian, and did not pretend to be one, but I recognized in his devotions an engineer's habit of calibrating. Prayer, he said, was not a ladder out of the sea. It was the way to breathe in it. I drew a little wave in the margin, embarrassed to be sentimental in a workplace document, and turned the page. We returned to the Tsimtsum. "Describe your last ordinary day," I said. He spoke of a sky that made no promises, of crewmen whose names he never learned, of the animals' restlessness before a change in weather that registers first in whiskers, then in everyone else. He remembered the length of the corridor from cabin to deck in steps, the way people measure when tape is not handy. He remembered dinner as food that intended to be forgotten, an engineer's blessing if I have ever heard one. He remembered the sound of cargo settling, a library's hush if books were heavy and made of breath. Here I posed questions that would matter later to my report. Exact cargo lists, positions of the lifeboats, the location of emergency lockers, the color of the tarpaulin, orange, as if the sea would misplace a smaller sky, the number of solar stills in the kit, the cheerful tone of the survival manual with its unfailing belief in the rational sequence: locate, ration, signal, fish, hope. We noted the whistle, the flares, the line and hook sizes. For a while it felt like the right kind of dryness, fact as canvas. Then the name returned like a tide: Richard Parker. In the shipping ledger, the name sat beside the Tiger's Latin classification in neat columns, a clerical swap recorded with bureaucratic innocence. "It happens," I said. "Often," he replied. It pleased me absurdly that we could agree about something so small. Agreement, even over a typo, is a plank. During a pause, the nurse arrived to check vitals. She adjusted the IV with a competence that stilled the room. I drank the hospital coffee, which tasted like a good intention grown tired. A snowplow scraped by the window below. A man in an impressive hat attempted to walk briskly without slipping. He failed with such grace, I wanted to applaud. These details will not appear in any official report, but I include them because life insists on being life even when we are trying to carve it into evidence. We resumed. I asked Pi to speak of fear. He did not dramatize, he systematized. Fear, he said, likes to be early. If you greet it at the door and give it a chair, it becomes a guest instead of a thief. I have interviewed survivors who preferred the opposite, to deny fear until it breaks in. I wondered if his hospitality toward fear is what kept his mind from inventing a louder monster, or perhaps it enabled a silence from which prayer could be heard. I did not say this. I wrote, "Attitude toward fear equals protocol, not confession." We turned to observations at sea. He remembered flying fish thudding against the tarpaulin, Dorado flashing like tossed coins, the sky at night busy with old fires, a phrase too beautiful for my clipboard, and yet there it was, spoken without self-regard. He described learning to use the still, that odd contraption that asks sunlight to perform a domestic service. He explained how he cleaned fish, not as a triumph, but as maintenance, the way one cleans a lens. He spoke of building a raft to create necessary distance from the other passenger. He detailed territory even there, a small border, negotiated with ropes and protocol. If his story was to be questioned, it would not be for lack of operational clarity. I asked about sickness, about time. He confessed that days sometimes lost their edges. He counted Not in dates, but in tasks. Check the line, tend the still, say the prayers, read a few sentences of the manual as if it were a patient friend. Sunrise arrives anyway, he said, but I wanted to be the sort of person who arrived with it. I made a note to steal that line for myself the next time paperwork felt like weather. A small joke loosened the air. I told him that I, too, kept a ritual at sea. I never trust a pen that boasts of being all weather. Such pens betray you when asked to prove their boast. He smiled and raised a finger. Then take a pencil, a humble creature with an eraser. We agreed the pencil is a modest philosopher, prepared to reconsider. I asked carefully about faith on the raft. He said that when Hindu mantras or Christian prayers or the Muslim shahada came to his lips, he did not audition them. He let them speak. On land, he said, you can decide which cup suits the tea. On the ocean, you are grateful for any cup that does not leak. I wrote, devotion as habit of gratitude, and underlined it because some sentences are handles for carrying heavy meanings. We circled the matter of the ice on the island, his algae island, with its skittering meerkats, its fresh water, its trees that whispered a warning if you were the sort to listen. I registered my professional skepticism. He registered his memory. I said we would return to it when we had finished stitching the rest. He accepted this with the patience of someone who knows that a quilt must be assembled before a pattern can be seen. As the afternoon paled, I asked him for the other version of events, the one without animals, not because I preferred it, but because my superiors would require a report that could be defended in meetings where metaphors are treated like smoke alarms set off by toast. He looked at me for a long moment, a look that was neither hurt nor defiant, simply attentive. You need a story that matches the boxes on your form, he said. I admitted as much. I will give it to you, he added, but only after you have the first. I agreed. It seemed decent to hear the story a soul tells itself before asking for the one it tells a system. But we still wonder whether truth must choose a single chair in the room when two are available and both hold the weight of grief. The ocean does not. She carries multiple temperatures in one body, currents that argue without cancelling each other. Perhaps a report can learn this humility too. On my way out, I stopped at the gift shop, a habit learned from years of visiting hospitals. I bought a postcard of a lighthouse and a cheap compass that wobbled as if impatient with the Earth's magnetism. Neither was necessary. Both were reassuring. In the elevator, a woman hummed under her breath the way people do when they trust the cables more than they trust their own silence. Snow kept falling, doing its old work of making edges gentle. Back at my small hotel, I spread my notes on the bed like placemats, and for the first time since the dossier found me, felt less like a clerk of calamity and more like a student. The next day we would continue, not toward spectacle, but toward the slow, disciplined heart of endurance. How a boy divided a day into survivable parts. How he measured danger without measuring out his hope. I set the alarm, then turned it off, then set it again. Some rhythms require training. If you are listening at home, perhaps you have also rearranged your evening to make room for someone else's ocean. Maybe you put rice in the cooker and forgot to press start. Maybe you will discover this later and laugh. Maybe you will look at your calendar and find a square with no writing on it and call it a small Pacific of your own. Rituals keep us. Stories do too. Tomorrow I would ask about the moment when the sky finally refused to remain ordinary, and I would ask carefully what it means when an animal leaves without a goodbye, and a boy learns that some departures are lessons in gratitude, not betrayal. For now, I turned out the light and allowed the room to become a little boat carrying me forward on a black and harmless sea. The third day, I asked Pi to take me, step by step, to the edge of the night where the ordinary failed to hold. He obliged with the careful pace of someone laying out stones across a river. He remembered a shift in the ship's breathing before anyone named it weather. The Tsimtsum seemed to inhale longer, exhale shorter, like a runner who has not yet admitted he is sprinting. There were footfalls in the corridor and the soft percussion of unsecured objects tapping their complaints. He rose. He mentioned the raincoats in the locker, the life jacket straps rough with salt. He remembered the alarm sounding not as shrill as you might imagine, more like a school bell that refuses to be ignored. I noted the time from the log. He gave me the time from his skin. I asked what he carried. "Only attention," he said, and then, like a boy who still trusts lists, a whistle, my sandals, a sense that I must move. He told me about the deck, the tilt that rearranges your loyalties, how a flaw you thought was yours becomes a negotiation. The crew moved with that practiced urgency that looks almost like calm. There were shouts in languages that do not require translation when urgency speaks through them. He did not dramatize the water coming in. He said, the sea was not entering, the ship was losing its hold. It was the sort of sentence an investigator cherishes for its precision of respect. We touched only briefly on the animals, a zebra unsteady, a hyena commenting in its own harsh register, later an orangutan on a bundle of bananas that bobbed like improbable lanterns. I will not recount what can be left as outlines. We agreed that some scenes do not need our emphasis, they ask us instead to keep our voices low. The official report allows for such omissions if the moral fact is intact. Fear, chaos, the unthreading of design. Pi mentioned Richard Parker indirectly then, a presence he sensed before he saw, as if the air around the tarpaulin had its own heartbeat. The tiger's name had already become a character in our notes. Soon the animal would claim it. How did he end up in the lifeboat? With honesty that negated theatrics, he said, by a sequence of small choices that looked like mistakes until they looked like survival. A thrown life ring, a miscalculated leap, the boat's free fall on its davits and then its slamming embrace of the water. He described the orange interior as a kind of temporary sunrise. He said the survival kit under the bench felt like a library whose books he had never wanted to read and now must. He described the sea anchor, that modest belief in drag and how it argues with panic for the right to slow things down. You can see, listener, how this might please a man of manuals. I asked for inventory. How many water packets? How many solar stills? The count of flares? 4. The rope coils, the grommets where the tarpaulin could be secured against spray, the knife blunt but not without use, and the dear, exasperating, hopeful survival manual with its diagrams crisp as a scout's salute. Pi recalled the dipper for rationing water. He described the seasickness tablets he would later ration not out of nausea, but out of the wish to keep options. He remembered the multi-tool that liked to hide in corners. He was not showing off. He was honoring the small republic of objects that keeps company with disaster. Where was Richard Parker? I asked finally. Because a report cannot live by implication alone. He gestured toward the tarpaulin, that bright membrane between two worlds. There was a shape, he said. Silence has shapes too. He offered no spectacle. He explained the logic that followed: establish territory, create distance, build the small raft from oars and rope and floats, not to escape, but to negotiate. Safety, he reminded me, is often a conversation rather than a wall. He did not deny fear. He told me he gave fear a seat, as he had said before, so it would not knock everything off the table. At this point, I asked him to slow the hour into minutes. He spoke of blowing the whistle into the wind and hearing nothing answer but the whistle's own echo against the tarp. He described the rain that arrived like a sudden generosity, and how he spread the tarp to catch it, disobeying one instruction to obey another. He told me he found the fishing kit and stared at the hooks as if they were characters in a play he had not auditioned for. "How long until hunger makes a student of you?" I asked. "Not long," he said gently, "but longer than fear. There is a tasteful way to handle what happened to the zebra, to the orangutan, to the hyena, and we chose it. We let their lives be lives without inviting the cruel light." He told me enough to understand loneliness arriving in stages. Of the tiger, he said only, a presence that clarified every decision. This is important. Some truths do not require elaboration. A tiger exists like a primary color. I think here of something plain, tea cooling beside a stack of laundry. Not everything about a crisis must be sung in minor key. Between our sessions, I took my shirts to the hotel sink and wrung them with a persistence that felt almost ceremonial. Down the hall, someone laughed at a television show's canned joke, and it was good that the world kept that small rhythm. At breakfast, I folded a napkin into a triangle and felt unreasonably pleased. These are ordinary buoyancies. We are made to rise when we can. Back in the room, I asked Pi about his first night on the Pacific. He said the stars came like relatives who don't ask questions, and he chose to be grateful for their company rather than offended by their distance. He conceded that he slept in increments, as one does in a waiting room, not to rest fully, but to practice the hope of waking. He counted in tasks, not hours. Check the sea anchor, read the manual, whisper the prayers that sort the inside of a day when the outside is unsortable. He told me he sang once, softly, not to declare bravery, but to find where his breath kept house. We touched the morning after, a sea that had decided to be kind for a while, flying fish sparking against the tarp, the first catch that felt like signing a modest treaty. He spoke of learning not to stare at the horizon as if it owed him an answer. He adjusted the raft, rehearsed the signals he would fire if a ship came, though none did, and he began the diary he could not write on paper, a list he kept in his head made of verbs. Now came the question professionals are paid to ask, but humans must earn the right to answer. Do you think everything you remember happened as you remember it? He met it without defensiveness. Memory is a boat, he said. It leaks where it leaks. But the shape. He glanced at the tarp. The shape holds. I did not push. There is a brutality in insisting on the scalpel when the patient is still stitching himself up with thread he found on the floor. But we still wonder whether accuracy alone can carry the kindness a story owes its survivor, and whether kindness without accuracy can carry the weight a story owes the world. The ocean, for her part, kept her counsel. I asked about signals again, and he, indulging me, described the mirror, the whistle, the flares he would not waste. He mentioned the sunburn that taught him the geometry of shade and the blisters that taught him the cost of gripping too tightly. He learned the trick of bait and the patience of fish. He discovered the solar still produces hope by the cupful, which is exactly the measure hope prefers. A small levity visited us. I confessed that as a young engineer I once misread a blueprint's legend and sent a team to the wrong pier. For an hour, cranes rehearsed a ballet for no audience. He laughed a light that reached his eyes without needing an invitation. Then you know, he said, the theatre of the useful mistake. We agreed that the right humility is not a performance but a tool. By the close of the session, my notebook was a neat mess. Lists beside metaphors, coordinates beside the quiet inventory of a human soul learning its measurements. Before leaving, I asked if he wanted anything from the outside besides the obvious. He said, pencil, if the hospital could spare one. I gave him mine, the one with the eraser, rubbed down to a polite dome. He turned it once in his fingers, as if acknowledging a small comradeship. That evening, snow had tired of being impressive and settled into being ordinary again. I stood by the hotel window and let the city's lights instruct me in proportion, many little certainties making a shape you can trust from far away. My report, when it was done, would need those lights points of cross-checking, named objects times. It would also need to honor the dark between them. We are poor investigators if we ignore either. Tomorrow, we would speak about the choice I had asked of him to supply a second version, the one that officials prefer because it cleans the sea of creatures and leaves only human weather. I would listen to it with the same attention, not because I doubted the first, but because truth often travels in a pair, like oars. If we are patient, the boat moves forward. The fourth session began with weather because survivors, like sailors, catalogue life by skies. Pi said the Pacific had moods the manual didn't chart, calm as a held breath, frowning, forgetful. He spoke of a morning when the sea chose to be glass. The sea anchor held the bow in a polite curtsy to the swell, and in that pause he rehearsed the day's negotiations, food, water, and most precarious of all territory. He explained how he threaded rope through the grommets of the tarpaulin, checked each knot with a tug that was half prayer, half inspection. He tended the solar stills like small greenhouses, calling each drop of water by its right importance. If an engineer worships anything, it is the reliable trickle. We came to the matter of training. He did not call it dominance, he called it agreement. He described how whistle and food and the strict geometry of space became a language. Blow, he said, gesturing, then reward never the other way round. He formed a habit of eye contact that was neither challenge nor retreat. This is where lesser tellers would reach for spectacle. He did not. He told me of Richard Parker's early seasickness, the feline's dignity offended but not erased. He kept to courtesy even in description. Respect, he said, is safer than fear because it lasts longer. I wrote that sentence twice by accident, then left both copies. Some redundancies are true. The raft fascinated me, a perimeter you can tow behind you, a second porch to the same dangerous house. He described lashing oars and life jackets into a float, paying out lines so the raft lived at a distance both measurable and meaningful. Distance, he said, is also a kind of kindness. He slept sometimes with one hand on the rope, that umbilical to his own prudence. He adjusted knots the way monks adjust lamps. On my page I drew a crude diagram boat, raft, line then, without intending, added a little arrow labelled "Room for Two Truths." I returned, as I must, to food. He listed the rations by count and then by conscience. He explained how he learned to fish, how failure taught him more than first success, how the gaff felt heavy with the implication of purpose. He said he spoke to the sea as one speaks to a stubborn friend gently and often. About the turtles, he offered only the outline that survival demands skills one hopes never to use. He spared me, and I will spare you, the furniture of detail. The point was not appetite. The point was interval, how he placed effort between fear and fatigue to keep both from forming a conspiracy. We detoured into the manual, that cheerful companion that proposes life as a sequence. It works, he said, if you are willing to forgive its optimism. He quoted a line about conserving energy as if it were a proverb. He described how he read the same paragraph on signals until the words learned him. I told him that when I was a young inspector, I copied part numbers onto my hand because paper liked weather defects at inconvenient times. He laughed, the kind of laugh that includes the other person without effort. In an investigation, moments of ordinary fellowship act like handrails on a wet stair. Midway, we paused for tiamine from a paper cup, his from the careful hands of the nurse who had mastered the art of not spilling kindness. Through the window, a child dragged a sledge uphill and then surrendered it to gravity with squeals that made passers-by into accidental witnesses of joy. None of this belongs in a formal report. All of it belongs in a human one. It loosened the knot in the room, the knot that tightens whenever we name the ocean. Back to procedure. He distinguished between time and rhythm. Time is indifferent. Rhythm is curated. He created hours by assigning them tasks: inventory, maintenance, prayer. He explained that devotion at sea was less a theology than a metronome. I did the puja with what I had, he said, and I said the Our Father because I had fathers to remember, and I whispered the Shahada because unity steadies the hand. There was no grand unification theory, only the plural grammar of gratitude. I am not a pious man, but engineering also serves a choir. We sing in our way to tolerances and fits. We ask the universe to please line up. I asked about storms. He answered like a steward of a museum he did not own. He described a squall that compressed the horizon. Waves that edited the world down to their own insistence. Lightning that sketched the boat and tiger in fleeting chalk. He secured the tarpaulin. He braced the mast. He trusted the sea anchor with more faith than doctrine could ask. He said the boat performed its small courage well. What did you feel? I asked. The question that is both essential and rude. Small, he said, and also in the right place. I understood. A gasket is small and also the right place. When the storm passed, the bioluminescence arrived at night, tiny scripts of light writing themselves along the bow. He confessed to an impulse to believe the ocean congratulated him. He corrected the thought as one corrects a child gently. No, it was the plankton doing what plankton do. But gratitude remained. We receive, he said, what is not intended for us and learn to call it blessing. I marked that with a star. Investigators, despite rumors to the contrary, keep private collections of sentences that save them from cynicism. We touched the first repair that failed, a knot that slipped because his hands had rushed. He did not hide it. He told me the cost was small an hour of rework, a lesson that interest compounds on impatience. I admitted in exchange that I once misread a load chart and scolded a crane operator who, it turned out, could have been my teacher. Then we are both graduates, he said, of the school of mistakes that did not kill us. We shook hands on it, ceremonially invisible. And of Richard Parker, how did coexistence feel when fear dulled into routine? Not safe, he said. Possible. He described how the tiger's presence insisted that every action be correctly sized. He did not try to love what should not be loved. He did not try to hate what simply is. He had, instead, a pact. You live, I live. The border is our friend. In my notes I wrote, border equals mercy. It felt accurate, in more places than a lifeboat. I asked, against my better instincts, whether he ever spoke aloud to the tiger as to a companion. He hesitated. Once, he said, to say that the sunrise was beautiful. Did the animal appear to understand? He smiled. Sunrises require no understanding. In that answer lived an ethic I wanted to keep. Share what is harmless to share. Keep mystery unbroken where breaking serves nothing. But we still wonder whether an account so measured risks sanding down the edges that prove its truth, whether restraint can be mistaken for invention, whether the absence of the lurid will be read as evasion rather than dignity. The sea, unconcerned with hearings and memos, continued that day to exist in all her plural moods. We ended with a small inventory of hope. In his list, a breeze at the right angle, the taste of fresh water, so new it felt like a first word, the sound of flying fish in flight, the sight of Dorado turning beneath the surface like coins in a transparent fountain, the whistle that carried further on cool air, the manual's increasingly dog-eared pages, the prayers that did not answer but always arrived. In mine, this boy's exactness, his refusal to decorate, his hospitality toward fear, his stewardship of the ordinary. We each took our lists and put them where we put valuable, she in his day, I in my drawer. On my walk back to the hotel, I passed a bakery where the glass steamed slightly from the business of morning. A tray of rolls released their warm breath into the air, and a woman used tongs the way a conductor uses a baton, and showy, precise. I bought one and stood under an awning to eat it, flakes of crust aligning themselves with the front of my coat as neatly as if they, too, believed in order. Nearby, a man patted his pockets in the choreography of someone who has lost his keys and found instead his patience. These unremarkable kindnesses felt like cousins to the knots on Pye's line. That night I set my compass on the bedside table and watched the needle sort itself out after I moved it. North, then a wobble, then north again. So do we. Tomorrow we would approach the island in his account. The strange algae with its meerkats, the hypothesis that many will dismiss before hearing. I would listen the way a compass listens, acknowledging the wobble, patient for the line to settle. I began with a confession, written at the top of my notes in block capitals. I do not believe in floating gardens. Writing the sentence cost nothing and cleared the throat of my skepticism. Then I put a line beneath it and added, "But I will listen." Good investigations are made of such twin sentences, one foot in doubt, the other in attention. Pye watched me prepare. Amused the way a patient is amused by a doctor sterilizing a stethoscope, they both know will soon find a living beat. "Take me there," I said, step by step, as if the map is being drawn under our feet. He obliged. The sea had been uncooperative for days, temperamental, withholding. His solar stills delivered cups of hope, but not feasts. Fish visited and left. Richard Parker conserved his strength with the elegance of a creature designed for waiting. Then one morning, the horizon grew a lowness that was not cloud. As the day clarified, the lowness became greener color he had taught himself not to expect. He described a cautious approach, sea anchor adjusted, oars set, the raft tested so that if the thing rejected them, they could retreat with dignity. Dignity, he added, is a survival tool. I wrote that down before my better judgment could remind me how unsympathetic a committee finds sentences that sound like epigrams. What he found, he said, was a mat of algae so dense that the oar entered with a resistance like thick soup and emerged with threads that clung. There were pools within the green fields, clear water, cupped in natural bowls sweet to the tongue by day. He tasted cautiously, then drank with a gratitude that does not ask permission to exist. He tied the rope from the lifeboat to a root-like tendril and stepped out. He did not say miracle. He said platform. I could follow a platform. He observed creatures small, bright-eyed, quick as punctuation, what he called meerkats. Though even he admitted the word felt like importing a dictionary into a place that had written its own. They regarded him with the pragmatic interest of neighbors who recognize a new tenant as a temporary arrangement. They were many, he said simply, and content to share. The tiger, for his part, disembarked with royal nonchalance and chose a spot that combined shade with vantage. Territoriality reasserted itself without quarrel. The island, if island, it was accepted these negotiations the way a city accepts traffic, as proof of life. He described the algae underfoot as springy, its surface giving slightly and then remembering itself. Roped pathways took shape by dint of walking. The line in his hand gave him the comfort of return. He ate the fruit, not luscious, he said, but serviceable, with strands like threads. He washed the salt from his mouth and felt his body register the change like a room brightening when someone remembers to draw the curtains. He spoke of the pools again, how by day they were bright and courteous, and how by evening they developed a taste he called restless. I asked him, as I always do when the extraordinary enters, to count the ordinary. How many hours of light? How did he secure the boat on the first night? What knot? He answered promptly, bowline and 2 half hitches, tarpaulin secured against dew, raft positioned as an annex. He slept on the mat with the rope looped round his wrist, the way one keeps a promise within reach. He woke to the chorus of the little animals and to Richard Parker returning from a night's regular predation in the pools, no detail necessary. The fact was sufficient. He looked satisfied, Pi said, which is the kindest form of reportage survival allows. On the second day he explored further. The algae formed trees towers whose trunks were braided ropes of living matter. He climbed one carefully, testing holds as if ascending a principle, and from the height saw the green spread like a continent built by patience. The meerkats swarmed in their tides, responding to shade and sun with a choreography that had learned itself over time. He returned with fruit that grew in pods, shaped like bulbs. When he cut one open with the knife from the kit, it revealed layers arranged with a logic that felt alien and compelling. How long did he stay? Long enough to mistake relief for conclusion, he said, and there was nothing of poetry in his voice, only the bruised wisdom of a person who has once believed in ending and discovered instead an intermission. He found that fresh water pooled sweetly by day and acquired a sharpness by night. The pools did not boil or fume, they merely altered in character the way certain people do when asked to carry a secret. The algae leaves left a film on his skin that rinsed off without argument. He wondered about shelter, about whether he could construct a hut, about the risk of forgetting the sky beyond the green. Then came the discovery that tilted the map. In one of the higher pods, curious about a bulge that did not belong to fruit, he pried apart the fibers and found, set within like a warning, the small, pale shape of a tooth. Not a seashell, not a pebble, a human tooth, smooth from time, lodged as if the fruit had grown around it. He stared at it the way a child stares at a truth that refuses to be arranged. He did not tremble, he descended. He walked to the edge of a pool and tasted its water at dusk, and knew without formulas that night transformed the island's gentleness into a hunger without spectacle. No melodrama, only a change of pH if one wanted to flatter science with an invitation it had not issued. He left the island the next morning, not with curses, but with bows 3 small bows, one for fresh water, one for shelter, one for instruction. He loaded the rations he had dried, coaxed Richard Parker aboard with the established routine, released the line, and felt the lifeboat accept again the old conversation with the sea. I might have stayed, he admitted, and grown specialized, like a creature that loses its eyes in a cave because darkness is faithful. He smiled, apologizing to no one. I felt, absurdly, a surge of professional pride. Decision is the most underrated piece of safety equipment. Here I paused, letting the pencil rest. Then I read back what he had said, careful with inflections, and allowed myself my duty. I asked the questions whose shape a room full of officials would later assume. Could he have misidentified the animals? Could the tooth have been embedded from flotsam? Could the change in water be attributed to natural cycles of algae? He entertained each question as if I had passed him small stones to weigh. Yes, he said, to more than one, and perhaps to others. He was generous with my caution. He did not confuse generosity with surrender. During our short break, I walked down to the vending machine and argued with it about exact change. It won. I bought a packet of peanuts from the gift shop instead, and ate them slowly by a window where the light had learned to be winter. A woman in a red scarf navigated a patch of ice with the elegance of a problem solved in 2 steps. A man on a bench coached a child through zipping a jacket, their fingers negotiating the small tyranny of a metal tooth that would not align. These little victories, zipper, scarf, peanuts, furnished my skepticism with kindness. Doubt without kindness is merely pride rehearsing. Back in the room, I told Pi I would, in my report, phrase the island conservatively a floating algal mass with associated fauna, diurnal nocturnal water chemistry variants, artifact embedded in botanical structure, and he nodded, amused by my translation. The sea, he said, permits many languages. I asked whether he regretted leaving. No, he said. Rescue can be the shape of leaving, he added, softer. And staying can be another word for forgetting. But we still wonder whether hospitality to the improbable is a dereliction of duty or its refinement, whether a story that enlarges the world's grammar teaches us to lie or to listen better. The sea offered no memorandum. She lifted her shoulder in a wave and turned, as ever, back to her work. We ended the session by looking forward, not back. The boat re-entered the Pacific that had taught him inventory and prayer. He described days that became clean with repetition. Check sea anchor, tend stills, fish, feed, whistle, rest, give thanks. He made no claim of heroism, only of continuation. Richard Parker resumed his stately indifference, which is a cat's most practical blessing. The sky practiced its spectrum of moods and occasionally settled on forgiving. In my notebook, I drew a small box around a single sentence. He chose the ocean again. Choice is evidence too. That evening, back in my room, I washed a mug by hand because the hotel sink makes every act ceremonious. I warmed my hands around the porcelain and thought of the island as a footnote written by the ocean in the margin of a long text. Some readers will skip it, others will read it twice and wonder whether the book would be poorer without that marginalia. I turned the cheap compass in my palm until north steadied, then lay it flat and watched it decide again. Tomorrow I would ask for the second version the one that empties the boat of animals and replaces them with the human shapes, a conference room will find easier to applaud. I would listen without cruelty. I would carry both stories as one carries a bowl with two hands. I came with the humility of a man about to ask for a map that erases the mountains he has already learned to climb. For the sake of the report, I said, and Pi understood at once. He adjusted his pillows, set the pencil I had given him parallel to the bed rail, and nodded. You need the story without animals. There was no bitterness in his voice, only the slight fatigue of someone willing to lift a second time what has already been lifted once. He began by removing the tiger, the hyena, the zebra. The orangutaniac slipped from the lifeboat as quietly as a shadow being called back by its owner. In their place, he set people. The zebra became a young sailor with a broken leg, a detail I recognized from the ship's infirmary log. An injury treated in haste before departure. A notation in a hand that tried to be neat on a rolling table. The hyena became a cook, French by accent and appetite for authority. The orangutan became Pi's mother, and here he did not say anything elaborate, only that her presence felt like a clean kitchen after a storm. Finally, the tiger would become by logic, more than by declaration, what remained when a boy must do what he cannot bear to name. He did not rush the arithmetic. He recounted the drift after the Tsimtsum went down, much as before. The orange tarpaulin, the manual, the solar stills, the sea anchor doing its modest theology of drag. He spoke of the sailor's pain without ornament, a suffering large enough to make adjectives look like poor furniture. He spoke of the cook's temper, the way hunger can make a mouth forget that words have shapes that bruise. He did not dramatize. He laid out the day-show food arrived by chance or by work, how water arrived by condensation and grace, how the sun wrote its lesson plan on skin. I asked, as gently as papers allow, how they lived together on the boat. He described roles that assembled themselves under pressure. The cook declaring himself indispensable to morale, the mother declaring that decency is not a luxury at sea, the boy declaring very little and learning very much. The sailor, he said, drifted between fever and a kind of elegant silence. I did not ask for medical detail. It was enough to know that injury complicates every arithmetic. When he came to the days that changed the balance, he kept his words spare. There was cruelty, he said, the kind that hides behind the excuse of need. There was defense of the boy by the mother, of the remnants of order by anyone who remembered order's taste. There was a deed from which a boy realizes childhood has been revoked without appeal. He described none of it in the language of spectacle. He gave me sequence and consequence. The cook, he said, eventually had the boats quiet to himself and discovered it was not the prize he had imagined. There are victories so lonely they fail to count. What of you? I asked. It is not fair to ask and less fair not to. He looked at his hand, then at the window, as if measuring the width of light. I learned, he said, that the will to live is not tidy. It borrows tools it later returns. With apologies, he paused. When the ocean puts you in a room with a door that locks from the outside, you make a new door. He did not say how. He did not need to. The shape of the lifeboat shifted in the air between us, and I understood that the tiger in the first story had always been one name for what the second story could not narrate without breaking something human in the telling. He spoke of the days after, how solitude changes flavor when it arrives to replace noise rather than to begin it. He kept the rhythms I already knew, prayer as metronome, fishing as arithmetic, signals rehearsed to please both hope and discipline. He kept the raft, the rope, the whistle. He kept the flying fish and the Dorado, the stars like patient witnesses. He kept the algae island out of the second story, not because he denied it, but because it belonged to the grammar of the first. Two languages, he said with a small smile, should not correct each other while they are still learning to speak. While he talked, the nurse came in and adjusted the IV with that neutral kindness that I have come to think of as a hospital's true anthem. She asked if he needed anything. He asked for warm water. She promised to return. As the door closed, a cart squeaked in the hall, then remembered its manners and kept still. A child laughed at an elevator's mirror. I mention these small sounds because they braided the starkness of the room with a softness that kept both of us from fraying. I asked him what he wanted me to do with the second version. "Write it," he said, because some people cannot read the first. He was not contemptuous, he was simply hospitable. "And what do you believe?" I asked, not as an official, but as a man whose pencil had begun to feel heavier than wood. He considered, then said, "I believe in the one that keeps me true." He did not specify which that was. Perhaps he meant that faithfulness is sometimes a choice about how to remember rather than what to remember, but we still wonder whether a truth that arrives in two shapes asks us to vote or to hold. Whether integrity is a single line or a pair of parallel lines that never touch and nevertheless guide a train. The ocean, consulted as ever, offered only her large silence, which is sometimes the most articulate answer available. To loosen the room, I told him a story about my son at age 8, how he once insisted a cardboard box was a spaceship and demanded that I log our launch in a notebook. I wrote "Liftoff, 1403, and he saluted. Later that day, he used the box for a fort. I added, "Recommissioned, 1720. We laughed at the idea that the same box could be both vessel and fortress, depending on the hour. "Stories," Pi said, "are like that box." A little later, I confessed my misadventure with a vending machine that refused my coin until I turned it saint-like the other cheek. He smiled, a mercy of an expression, if ever there was one. We returned to the report. I told him I would include times, inventories, the log of the Tzimtzum, and both accounts one labeled animal analogues, the other human sequence with notations that where the two align in structure, credibility is strengthened by convergence rather than weakened by metaphor. He nodded at the word convergence. "Yes," he said. "Currents meet. A boat moves." He asked unexpectedly about my work, whether I had ever filed a memo I wished to revise after learning a thing my form had no box for. I admitted that I had, how once I had insisted a faulty valve caused a slow leak, only to discover later that fatigue in a weld had taught the metal a lesson I had not imagined. "Did you correct it?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "with an addendum." He seemed pleased. "Then you know," he said, "how to honor both the first understanding and the second." Near the end of the hour, he asked if I had seen the winter sun on the hospital's south windows. I said I had. It makes a clean rectangle on the floor near the elevators at a certain time. "It reminds me," he said, "that light is also a visitor." A simple sentence, and yet it set something right in me. We sat without speaking for a moment, as professionals sometimes must when they realize their work has become briefly, accidentally, almost a friendship. I stood to go and promised to return with a draft of the statement for his review. He thanked me in the courteous way he had of thanking the world for trying. In the corridor, the clock announced itself again, unembarrassed by its habit of dividing what refuses division. Outside, a bus hissed, a branch tapped glass. 2 students compared exam results and discovered that shared disappointment is a kind of comedy. The day, like a competent stagehand, moved the scenery without demanding applause. Back in my room, I set the 2 accounts side by side on the bedspread, the way a navigator lays out twins of a Chardonnay showing currents. The other depths. I drew small arrows at points where the structures matched. The broken leg, the cook, the mother, the shape of fear wearing 2 costumes. I thought of the algae island as an emblem not of deception, but of interlude, a reprieve that teaches as much as it protects. Then I wrote the sentence that would close my memo's summary. The survivor presents 2 narratives whose structural isomorphism argues for psychological truth. The choice between them is not between true and false, but between modes of bearing the same weight. I placed the compass on the windowsill. The needle quivered, then settled. North is real, even when the road bends. The next day I would bring Pi my typed pages, and we would check commas and facts and the spelling of names, because even stories that carry souls across water must arrive with their paperwork in order. For now, I turned off the light and allowed the dark to be what it has always been, a room waiting for morning's patient knock. I arrived with a stack of typed pages, clipped so neatly they looked like a modest appliance. Chiba joined me, my colleague, whose gifts include a patient ear and a memory for numbers that border on affection. He set a small tape recorder on the tray table, old-fashioned but reliable, and produced a fresh cassette as if the 20th century still had a few errands to run. Pi nodded at us, the way a host nods at guests he trusts to move through his house without opening the wrong drawers. We read the statement aloud, first the animal account, then the human sequence, because the ear catches fractures, the eye forgives. I took the animal narrative, Chiba took the human one. As we spoke, Pi watched our mouths with the unblinking attention of someone who has learned to treat language as a toolkit, not a veil. When I mispronounced Pondicherry, he corrected me kindly, Mo. The way a teacher corrects a student who has done the homework but not the accents. When Chiba stumbled on grommets, Pi smiled. Islets, he offered. We added the synonym. Bureaucracy loves a second word. We paused at inventories to match numbers. 4 flares confirmed. 2 solar stills we corrected to 3. My own handwriting had been parsimonious. Water rations, we listed packets by count and shelf life. Chiba, who adores lists the way some adore gardens, read them like a liturgy. It dignified the small republic of objects. When we reached the first account's mention of Richard Parker vomiting from seasickness, Pi confirmed the detail with a faint, apologetic smile, as if he owed the animal the courtesy of not making nausea sound like a flaw. I added a parenthetical in the margin, feline vestibular response early days. Committees enjoy the taste of clinical words. It reassures them that reality is housebroken. We stopped at the island description. Chiba glanced at me. I nodded. We retained the conservative phrasing we had agreed upon. Floating algal mass, faunal colonization, diurnal, nocturnal variants in water chemistry. Pi did not insist on romance. He only asked that the line about finding the tooth remain exactly as he had said it. Discovered in a pod, polished by time. It need not persuade, he added. It only needs not to lie. I underlined the sentence as one underlines a verse without the courage to recite it. For the second version, we slowed our voices where the air thins. Chiba read the passage about the young sailor with the broken leg, and Pi's hand moved slightly as if to steady a glass. We included the cook, his appetite for control sharpened by hunger, and the mother whose dignity was a kind of weather. I chose my verbs with the precision of a man packing a fragile object. Declared, insisted, defended. We did not name deeds the room could not safely hold. We named their consequences. We added the line Pi had offered earlier. The will to live borrows tools it later returns with apologies. We did not soften apologies to regrets. Apologies imply a face, a door, a hand extended. Regret can be performed to an empty room. Which one will your superiors accept? Pi asked when we finished. The question contained no complaint, only logistics. I told him the truth, that the structure common to both would interest them, that isomorphism, I used the word, and then translated it, would argue for a psychological convergence worth more than a quarrel over genre. He laughed softly at genre, a bookish word in a hospital bed. Shipwreck, he said, is a poor genre anyway. It sells too many answers in the middle and too few at the end. Chiba asked about Pondicherry Zoo again, his way of testing girders we had already bolted. Pi warmed to the topic with that technical affection I recognized. He spoke of enclosure design, of how moats do more than restrain, they declare a contract. He explained feeding protocols, territorial cues, the difference between dominance and clear signage. Chiba scribbled diagrams. I watched an invisible bridge assemble between a boy's childhood and his raft. What looked like miracle at sea often had training for a parent. I made a note. Zoo as rehearsal for coexistence with fear. That phrasing would travel well in a report. More important, it travelled well in my head. We addressed timeline. That Simpson departed on a documented date. The weather logs showed nothing dramatic. The radio silence had that bureaucratic pathos I have come to know. Empty lines, printed with confidence. We synchronized Pi's task counting with calendar days anchored to the diary fragments he kept in memory. Chiba produced a simple chart grid paper, tidy, squares matching events. Storm, first catch, injury fever, island interlude, return to open sea. The neatness of it would later seduce a committee into believing the world is manageable. One must let them be seduced. They are less cruel when they feel competent. But we still wonder whether the cleanliness of a chart risks obscuring the raggedness that keeps a soul honest, whether the form that saves a life on paper ever learns to bow to the life that refuses to fit. The ocean does not apologize for her graphs. She adds a wind and asks us to try again. A small intermission. At lunchtime we escorted Pi, with the nurse's blessing, to a sunlit alcove where a fiddle-leaf fig did its best impression of a tree that knows winter is just a rumor. I bought 2 custard buns from the cafeteria, discovering that their filling has the moral advantage of refusing to stay tidy. Chiba, who cannot eat in peace while a question goes unanswered, asked Pi whether the survival manual's tone had comforted or irritated him more. Both, Pi said cheerfully, but I thanked it for its optimism and ignored it when it tried to be my boss. We laughed, jelly-throated, and the nurse looked pleased to see Mirth paying a visit without signing in. Back in the room, we recorded a short addendum in Pi's voice, 30 seconds, that a tribunal might actually listen to. His name, the statement that he had reviewed the document, that he affirmed its accuracy to the best of memory under the conditions of prolonged exposure to sea, sun, hunger, and fear. He added, unprompted, and prayer, then looked at me as if to check whether the word required a permit. I shook my head. Let it stand, I said. The recorder clicked, the mechanical amen of a machine completing its small vocation. We turned to the subject we had postponed like adults postponing dessert. Belief. Do you believe me? Pi asked, not as a test, but the way a craftsman asks whether the chair wobbles. I practiced the only honesty I know. I believe the shape of your truth, and I respect the tools you used to carry it. He accepted this as one accepts a cup of water, grateful for temperature rather than label. "And you?" I asked. "Which keeps you faithful?" He considered. "The one where I am not alone," he said, "even when I am." He did not need to explain. We had both met Richard Parker. We rehearsed, briefly, what would happen next. The consulate, the insurers, the questions that prefer boxes to tied lines. Chiba would file the technical report. I would add the narrative memorandum with both accounts and my note on structural convergence. We would include cargo manifests, the zoological ledger with Richard Parker mislabeled, the lifeboat model annotation, the photographs of healed blisters and sunburn patterns, which, in their unromantic geometry, would persuade more than any flourish. I would also stubbornly include a line about gratitude, subject credits prayer, as rhythm essential to cognitive stability. The brain trusts rhythm, committees trust brains. It might pass. As we prepared to leave, Pi asked for the pencil again. He sharpened it with a small plastic sharpener the nurse fished from a drawer. We all watched the curl of shavings as if it were a rare seashell. He wrote a single word at the bottom of the page. "Thank you." It looked too big, then just right. I remembered my son at 8, saluting a cardboard spaceship. Gratitude, like imagination, does not require excellent materials. In the corridor, fluorescent lights hummed their impartial hymn. A janitor steered a mop the way a helmsman steers a vessel that will never be featured on a postcard, and yet always arrives where it needs to, outside. The sky had found its mid-afternoon grey that makes everything else volunteer to be colourful. Chiba cleared his throat, a signal he was about to say something that mattered. "You like the first story better," he said. I admitted as much. "Not because of the animals," I added, "but because of the courtesy it extends to what we cannot bear to list." He nodded as if I had finally named the correct bolt in a tangle of fittings. That evening my hotel room smelled faintly of printer ink and winter. I spread the pages on the bed like nautical charts, currents on one, depths on the other, and drew small stars where the two maps agreed. Whistle, flares, sea anchor, manual, flying fish, Dorado, prayers, fear, given a chair. I wrote one last line for tomorrow's cover memo. Recommendation: accept narrative with dual register. Its fidelity is evidenced not by singularity of image, but by consistency of protocol. Then I turned the compass in my palm until north, forgave my clumsiness, and settled. If you are listening at your kitchen table, perhaps you are rinsing a cup or checking a child's homework or rescuing a pot from boiling over. These are beautiful, ordinary rescues. They remind us that not every survival wears an epic's costume. Some arrive folded in the small corners of a day, waiting for us to notice. Tomorrow, we would push the story's prow toward landfall, toward the parting at the edge of Mexico, where Richard Parker would offer the final lesson in unadorned departure. For tonight, I allowed the dark to draw its gentle tarpaulin over the day, and I slept with my hand figuratively on the rope that keeps a boat honest. We had postponed the shore long enough. "Take me to the day the ocean decided to return you," I said. And Pi, with that careful courtesy of his, nodded once. He described a dawn that did not perform. The sky woke without ceremony, the sea anchor shouldered the swell like a reliable friend, and the solar stills offered their small cups of consent. He was doing the old liturgy: check the ropes, scan the horizon, blow the whistle into an indifference that had long ago ceased feeling personal. when the water changed color. Green took on a thickness, he said, and the waves grew shy. He did not say shoal or shelf. He said what he saw, the Pacific beginning to practice being shore. He took in the smell before the sight, the law of landfall, written in salt and leaf. It was not perfume, it was rot, doing its honest work. The manual had a paragraph about the sense of proximity, its cheerful tone pretending it could hold the throat steady. He trimmed the line to the sea anchor, feathered the oars, and let the boat bargain with the last push. Flying fish no longer flung themselves on the tarpaulin. The water grew busy with smaller lives that prefer edges. He tasted a light sweetness on the air, the patient exhale of a continent. How was Richard Parker, I asked, as if tiger and shore were not a sentence we already knew. Composed, he said, which is a cat's profession. The raft trailed obediently behind as they slipped into shallows where mangrove roots rose like a congregation kneeling. The boat's bottom found sand and then insisted on it. The world changed categories with a gentle, convincing sound. Pi did not attempt a speech. He secured the oars, looped a bowline, and with a care that honored both fear and gratitude, climbed out. He spoke of the sand as if it were bread after fasting course, certain, uninterested in debate. The mangroves crowded the light into narrow phrases, and the insects read them aloud. He sank to his knees and did not dramatize prayer, only named it. I thanked, he said, because grammar mattered less than breath. This is the sort of sentence committees call non-actionable. It is the sort of sentence the soul calls instruction. And then the thing that has the dignity of inevitability occurred. Richard Parker stepped from the lifeboat, unannounced, whole, uninterested in ceremony. He did not prowl or pounce. He committed to walking. Between root and shade, he chose a line and followed it. No glance back, no curtain call. The boy, who had shared a horizon with a presence misnamed and dearly feared, watched a stripe become brush, a chapter turn itself without help. He waited, he told me, waited for some acknowledgement, a final punctuation. It did not come. Perhaps, he said, it is not the work of a tiger to teach a bow. He did not say it bitterly. He said it like weather. I paused to make sure my pencil did not scratch the page loud enough to be mistaken for judgment. "And you?" I asked. "I lay down," he answered. The ground had been patient. I gave it weight. He slept the way a rope rests when a job is done coiled, still remembering the pull. He woke to voices, men from a village, he said, shirts rolled, feet competent, eyes that recognized the shape of trouble without needing a glossary, lifted him with the practical tenderness of people who have repaired nets and cradled children. They did not sing. They made shelter from a tarp and branches, offered water whose taste he can recall even now, and fed him something flat and warm that he did not name, because hunger prefers verbs. They tilted the lifeboat to pillage its useful democracy. Rope, knife, the ever-faithful survival manual, now dog-eared into friendship. They were neither thieves nor saints. They were neighbors. A truck came at its bed, a parliament of dented items, and Pi discovered the inland geography of mercy, jolts, dust, the mathematician's proof that each bend of a road arrives with a new fact. A clinic received him, where a nurse counted his ribs with her eyes and decided not to remark on them. Mexico, he learned the word as a place, and then as a kindness, took custody. I added to the typed page the details my office likes. Approximate coordinates from prevailing current models, tide tables that make administrators feel at home, a note on mangrove distribution along that coast. I included, at Pye's insistence, no flourish. Facts, he said. Have enough work to do. Let me loosen the air. At lunch, I stood in line for soup, whose steam fogged the glass and made everyone appear kinder. A man 3 places ahead insisted the cashier go first with her tray because her break is shorter than lunch. I saw a child teaching his mitten to cooperate with a zipper. The mitten learned and was praised. In the gift shop, I bought a postcard of a pelican landing wings out, feet indecisive, the exact grace of awkward arrivals. None of these are nautical facts. All of them kept me from confusing solemnity with accuracy. Back in the room, I asked Pye to describe the departure scene once more, not to test him, but to honor it with a second hearing. He repeated the essentials precisely, then added a small thing I had missed. I wanted to say the word "go" out loud. As a permission, he said, but I decided the forest had already granted it. We let the sentence sit like a warm stone in the palm. I inquired how he felt about the manner of rescue. Some prefer trumpets and headlines. Some ask for a ride and a bed. Humane, he said. Untranslated, he meant that help arrived without conversation about deserts. He described a woman at the clinic who brought water in a cup and then returned with another without being asked. The liturgy of enough enacted twice. A Dr. Browse furrowed not with suspicion, but with arithmetic, tapped knees, wrists, made notes that sounded like the world assembling itself around the body's claims. They weighed me, he said, amused, as if numbers had missed me. Numbers, I thought, are sentimental. They hate being left out. We touched again the end of companionship without naming it tragedy. Did you wish he had looked back? I asked, and the room hushed the way auditoriums do before a solo. Part of me, yes, he said. The part that thinks love is a mirror. Another part was relieved that he remained himself to the end. He allowed a half smile. I had trained myself to respect borders. He honored one. In my notes, departure equals intact boundary. In another life, I would have framed that line for my office wall. But we still wonder whether gratitude can coexist with the small wound of no farewell, whether the stories that save us must leave us with a quiet ache to prove they were real. The ocean, whose entire art is leaving and returning without apology, offered again her lesson in tides. We closed the session by rehearsing the path from shore to paper, from villagers to clinic, from clinic to consulate, from consulate to interview with 2 men who now knew how to ask for 2 stories and hold them like bowls under the same rain. I promised to include in my memorandum a modest sentence about Richard Parker's going no grand theory, just an observation that sometimes the noblest kindness a story can offer is refusing to decorate an ending that was already complete. Later, at the hotel, I put my shirt in the laundry drum and watched it turn soapsured galaxy, sleeve a constellation, button a small moon. It is a humble pleasure to witness something be cleaned and declared ready again. I brewed tea from a tea bag that had survived my suitcase since Tokyo and tasted its bureaucratic courage. On the desk, my compass did its quiet trick and found north despite the metal bruises of a modern building. I wrote the day's summary in the margin of my typed pages: landfall, departure, ordinary rescue, evidence sufficient, dignity intact. Tomorrow we would begin the business of signatures and stamps, the choreography by which the world believes its own kindness. For tonight, I allowed the mind to place shore where it belonged, not as a triumph over sea, but as the sea's consent. I turned out the light, and in the dark heard the softest sound, the whisper a page makes when laid on top of another page, the administrative echo of a boy laid gently on sand. Paperwork, like shore, announces itself first by smell, the faint starch of forms, the mimeograph ghost of instructions, the comforting gum of envelopes. The morning after our landfall session, I arrived with a folder that would make sense to an office, and, I hoped, not offend a soul. The consulate had furnished its tidy arsenal, statement templates, a chain of custody sheet for the tape cassette, a cover page with boxes that believe the world is obliged to fit. Chiba had already ruled lines on a yellow pad as if he were preparing fields for sowing. Pi greeted us with a nod that said he was ready to work. Ready, in other words, to translate life into the lawful grammar of acknowledgement. We began by fixing dates. The Tsimtsum's departure and last radio check aligned with registry logs I'd cabled for from Tokyo. The weather entries, high-pressure systems untroubled, nothing operatic sat on the page with the strange modesty events often have before they become history. We placed Pi's day-keeping, his task, clock of stills, tending and prayers, against a provisional calendar, building a bridge from ritual to time. Chiba, happiest when two columns agree to shake hands, hummed approval. It should pass muster, he said, and smiled the small smile of a man who respects both truth and meetings. Names, I said next, and we wrote them carefully. Piscine, Molitor Patel, Pi, Santosh and Gita. His parents, the brother he spoke of briefly, the crew he did not know well enough to list, the young sailor, the cook who in one story wore a human face and in another wore a hyena's appetite for advantage. We wrote Richard Parker, the tiger whose mislabeled crate had promoted a hunter to prey and left a bureaucracy none the wiser. I underlined that clerical error it would reassure my superiors that the story knew how to furnish itself with office-grade detail. We recorded objects again not to be redundant, but because inventory is the ritual by which survivors are welcomed into the temple of the plausible. Orange tarpaulin, sea anchor, 3 solar stills, 4 flares, mirror, whistle, grommets at regular intervals, survival manual with its chirpy consolations, knife, fishing kit with hook sizes Pi remembered as if they had once been classmates. We added his raft oars, life jackets, rope, the annex to caution that kept territory sensible. In a margin I noted, for the benefit of committees that admire vocabulary, protocol observed with consistency. When we reached the landfall, Pi repeated the mangrove and sand with the stillness of reciting a prayer without trying to persuade anyone. He mentioned again the villagers, show their competence arrived without adjectives, how water was offered, then offered again how Mexico became a word that meant both relief and return. We fixed approximate coordinates by current and drift models. We footnoted tide tables breadcrumbs for people who like their kindness quantized. On the line that asked for remarks of a technical nature, I wrote what I knew was true: lifeboat performance consistent with design under duress. Then, because justice requires appetite, we read aloud both accounts once more. Chiba, for whom fairness is not a posture but a habit, suggested we annotate points of structural equivalence: the broken leg that maps to the zebra, the cook to the hyena, the mother to orangutan, the tiger to the unnameable will that remained when a boy ran out of childhood. I drew a column of arrows between the narratives, careful not to reduce them to mere code, but honest about their conversation. In that column, my pencil felt heavier. Some arrows are weight-bearing. At midday, we paused because hospitals insist that life should also be soup. In the cafeteria, my tray complained quietly. The ladle proposed broccoli as destiny. At the next table, a teenager performed that delicate surgery where one removes an onion from a sandwich without insulting the bread. His grandmother applauded with her eyes. A volunteer pushed a book cart that jingled. 2 paperbacks fell into companionship on the 3rd shelf. These domestic comedies kept me from mistaking severity for seriousness. Back upstairs, we set the tape recorder on the tray and captured a brief formal affirmation in Pi's voice. He named himself and said that to the best of his memory, under exposure to sea, sun, hunger, fear, and prayer, the account was accurate. He included the word prayer again without apology. I let it stand. I have learned that forms are improved by the presence of words they cannot measure. We then rehearsed the ritual of signatures. Pi signed the statement in a hand that looked newly acquainted with pens. I countersigned. Chiba attested as witness. We stamped the Pegesa red geometry that consoles governments. The nurse brought warm water and watched us the way one watches a strange theatre in a familiar room. It struck me that a signature is a kind of shore, the place where something accepts being seen. Sute, Pi said after the paper ceremony. May I ask a question? He was all courtesy. Ask, I said. When you return, he said, what will your office say? I told him truthfully they would be pleased by the consistencies, pleased by the calm of our tables, uneasy about the island, relieved by the human sequence, quietly charmed by the tiger despite themselves. He laughed. It is hard not to like a tiger, he said. It is hard, I agreed, especially one that leaves without breaking a chair. Chiba, always the precise one, asked a last battery of clarifications he thought the insurers would require. Distances, durations, whether a flare was attempted when aircraft noise was heard. It wasn't. Whether the manual suggested conserving signals. It did. Whether seasickness abated in Richard Parker after the first days. It did. These were the sorts of questions that answered keep letters of indemnity from multiplying like weeds. Pi answered with patience that did not feel performative. I admired that grace. Some people think survival confers entitlement to impatience. He seemed to believe survival confers the duty to be exact, but we still wonder whether exactness alone absolves us of the obligation to bow, whether a correct ledger, even one written under the tents of mercy, can carry the softness a story owes the person who had to live it. The sea who keeps immaculate accounts in sand and yet erases them nightly taught me my answer before I could draft it. To loosen the room, I told my favorite failure. How, early in my career, I once carried a clipboard through a yard in Yokohama like a talisman, and then discovered I had audited the wrong ship for an hour, 2 vessels dressed alike, my pride the only distinguishing mark. Chiba laughed so hard his glasses required a reset. Pi grinned and offered the proverb of his own invention. A checklist is a map. It does not know the street vendor. We kept it. I suspect the ministry will not, but sentences do not sulk when they are kept in private. We tidied the folder. The cassette slid into its white sleeve, like a message into a bottle. Destination known. I affixed the return address of the ministry office in Tokyo and wrote a small note for the courier. Handle as you would a memory you would like to keep. Indulgent, yes. But even couriers are human. In the doorway, Pi asked for the pencil once more and wrote a name I did not recognize on the back of a pamphlet. A teacher, he said, who told me the sea is only frightening when it is not your teacher. He gave the pamphlet to the nurse. That evening, with the day sorted into envelopes, I walked to a post box and gave bureaucracy its due. On the way back, I stopped at a small bodega where a radio played a love song badly and convincingly. The owner sold me a tangerine. Its peel broke into a bright spiral that my son would have admired if he were here. In my pocket, the cheap compass fussed and then forgave. At the hotel desk, a woman placed a parcel for me on the counter cable copies from Tokyo, confirming receipt of earlier faxes. The ministry, staid as a ledger stone, was moving. Night found me with 2 drafts on the bedspread. Technical report and narrative memorandum. In the technical, I wrote the line, "No one quotes, but everyone respects." cause undetermined, evidence insufficient for definitive failure mode assignment. In the narrative, I wrote the line I knew would trouble and perhaps redeem. Presented with two accounts, the investigators note structural convergence suggesting a single lived event born by dual rhetoricone pragmatic, one emblematic. I added a quieter sentence for myself. Choose the story that keeps you most honest. Before sleep, I phoned my son to ask about his science fair. He had built a barometer from a jar and a balloon and announced that weather could be predicted if one were patient with air. Remember to label your axes, I said, bureaucrat to the last. He yawned theatrically and said, Remember to sleep, Dad. The advice suited both of us. Tomorrow we would schedule the consulate handoff, book our flights, and return to people who had waited for us without knowing they had. I would miss the steady geometry of this room, the way the nurse's cart argued against despair by refusing to squeak, the way Pi's voice made facts and grace agree to share a bench. The ocean would remain where she has always been, in her place, which is to say in all places, teaching by repetition and surprise. For now, I turned the lamp so its circle of light resembled a small, kind porthole. I set the compass beside it and watched the needle practice faith. Then I put my pencil to rest and listened for the softest proof that paper can carry weight, the sigh a folder makes when closed after good work. The consulate's waiting room wore its dignity like a wool coat, practical, a little itchy, determined to outlast weather. A flag stood in a brass base that believed in the floor. Behind glass, a clerk arranged stamps as if they were chess pieces that preferred stalemate. Chiba and I arrived with our folder, the one we had tailored to fit a government's idea of legibility without trimming a survivor's truth. Pi came with the nurse, who carried a small thermos, and the authority that comes from having seen bodies learn to be houses again. The consular officer, a man whose neat tie and tired smile could have been issued with the building, greeted us and ushered us into a room that had been designed by a committee with a keen sense of rectangles. We presented the statement, the tape cassette in its white sleeve, and the cover memo that introduced the dual accounts. The officer read quickly, then slowly, then the way people read when they have realized they must not miss a hinge. He took out a pen with pleasant heft, signed where signatures convert witness into record, and asked Pi if he wished to add anything. Pi said only, "Thank you," a sentence that filled the room more than the flag. We shook hands, Chiba with both of his, I with one, the officer with the habit of shaking hands daily. The nurse tucked away the thermos. For a moment no one moved, then official time resumed. Documents slid into envelopes, a stamp thumped approval. The officer polished a smudge from the glass on the framed seal as if the nation had a forehead. We were given receipt numbers and instructions about where the record would live. It is comforting to know where a story will sleep. In the corridor, Pi asked if we would return to see him before we flew. "Yes," I said. "It would be poor manners to leave without learning how your tea tastes this afternoon." He smiled. We did return. He showed us a postcard a volunteer had brought, a lighthouse, the same image I had once bought without telling him, as if symbols were homing birds. He had written on it a list of daily tasks: breathe, pray, remember, forgive, eat if possible, be kind when possible. "A manual," Chiba said, softly. Pi shrugged, cheerful in his humility. "A very short one." The next morning the airport performed its secular ritual. Announcements, moving belts, the choreography of shoes, leaving and returning to feet. On the plane, Chiba fell asleep with the deliberate guiltlessness of a man who trusts the future to announce itself. I reread the report and underlined nothing. I looked out at a sky that could not be bothered to be dramatic, and felt the old gratitude for engines, metal confidence, doing its invisible arithmetic. A child in the row ahead told her father that clouds were cotton candy for giants. He said, with a diplomacy I admired, "Perhaps on festival days." We laughed into our cups. Tokyo returned us to ourselves with winter and order. At the ministry building, a rectangle designed by a cousin of the consulate, we filed our technical report and narrative memorandum. The meeting room gathered chairs as if expecting a choir. A director with an expression that had learned the economy of yes and no read silently, while I offered the highlights aloud. I kept the sentences short, domesticated for meetings, cause undetermined. Lifeboat behaved within spec. 2 narratives structural overlap. Recommendation, accept, both registers. The director nodded at the right intervals. Somewhere a photocopier added its snow to the world. Questions arrived, competent and predictable, as weather systems on a chart. A man from insurers asked about the flares. I answered. A woman from maritime safety asked about solar stills yield. Chiba produced our figures, pleased, like a magician retrieving a dove that is also a table of numbers. Someone said, "Algae Island with the face you make before a sneeze." I offered our conservative phrasing, our coordinates conjecture, our tooth discovered in a pod, polished by time. The room made the polite noise institutions make when they have chosen to be neutral. There are worse choices. A younger official, new enough to risk curiosity, asked which version I believed. He did not mean to trap me. He meant to learn which map I carried in my glove compartment. I believe, I said, the structure that holds both. The first story is the one I prefer to live with. A small quiet followed, then the older director smiled the way a tailor smiles at the right seam. "Yes," he said mildly. "The better story is often the truer one for people. We will note acceptance of the account that maintains protocol and dignity." The minute-taker's pencil did its little dance. Somewhere, the report grew a spine. At lunch, bureaucracy fed us its reliable benterise, a square of omelette with the exact sweetness of restraint, pickled daikon that remembered sun. Chiba reported his chopsticks had finally learned to cooperate with that one slippery mushroom. We applauded in the understated way lunchrooms prefer. On the street below, a courier dodged puddles like a man who has already calculated today's socks. I phoned my son. He told me the barometer had behaved, the balloon's skin dipping and swelling on schedule. "Air keeps its promises," he said. "Sometimes," I replied, and he sighed, an agreement that forgives. Back at my desk, I drafted the cover letter to accompany the packet bound for the shipping company and their insurers. I wrote, "The survivor has supplied 2 internally consistent narratives with significant structural congruence. The investigative team accepts the account employing animal analogues as consistent with cognitive stability under extreme duress and consonant with observed protocol." I added a line for myself and then deleted it. The soul also has procedures. Better to keep some sentences here where oxygen is generous. I wrote a letter to Pi informal, not on ministry paper. I told him we had filed, that his courtesy had elevated even our forms, that if he ever visited Tokyo I would buy him tea at a place that keeps its kettles honest. I enclosed the compass, the little one from the hospital gift shop. This is not needed when one knows where one is. I wrote, but sometimes it pleases the hand. I included a photograph my son had taken of his balloon barometer, the inked line practicing weather. "We are all measuring," I wrote, "and we are all learning what cannot be measured." A week later we convened the final review where the table's surface shines with the particular cleanliness of decisions already made. The director signed the acceptance page with the unceremonious flourish of the competent. Chiba stamped the last stamp, a red square as decisive as a harbour light. I felt not triumph, not relief either, a smaller emotion, finer grained. The satisfaction of knowing the papers match, respectfully, what a voice said when it was given quiet. But we still wonder whether the act of choosing the better story risks flattering our need for beauty, whether we sanctify metaphor because it spares us from naming ugliness, whether faithfulness to a survivor is measured by the accuracy of our minutes or the mercy of our listening. The ocean, when consulted on the matter, kept to her two habits, invitation and indifference. She will receive ships, whatever we decide to call her. To loosen the seriousness, allow me 3 domestic scenes. First, a train at evening, crowded, everyone pretending not to know everyone. A woman steadies a stranger's elbow as the car lurches. Neither speaks. Gratitude attends silently. Second, my kitchen, where a kettle whistles like an old friend who has learned one song well. I set out cups. My son experiments with the barometer and announces tomorrow will be fair. I tell him weather enjoys students. Third, outside, a stray cat picks its way along a fence with the composure of a tightrope walker who trusts neither rope nor audience and proceeds anyway. We are all making landfalls somewhere. One night I dreamed the lifeboat sat in our ministry conference room, the tarpaulin staked to the carpet with office pens, the sea anchor trailing down the corridor like a banner against haste. In the dream, Richard Parker did not appear. The empty seat beside me did the work, quiet and complete. When I woke, I was not sad. The cat's gift, I decided, is to leave the room without making you responsible for its tale. In due time, a reply arrived from the company, polite, cautious, grateful for an undetermined cause that did not implicate maintenance too loudly. The insurers acknowledged receipt, appended a paragraph about act of God their lawyer had likely written soberly, and signalled that reimbursement would proceed. I suppose this is a happy ending for paper. For the rest of us, the ending is a room that remembers a voice. On a Sunday, out of habit more than plan, I walked by the harbour where ferries practice the art of leaving and returning without melodrama. A boy tossed breadcrumbs to gulls and was surprised by their confidence. His mother laughed, the forgiving laugh of people who know bread multiplies in small ways. I took from my pocket the stub of the pencil I had given Pi and traced a small circle in the air, the Greek letter he had claimed years ago to rescue a name. A circle does not end, it meets itself. On the water, a ferry turned and made the same argument. That night I placed our file on the shelf where completed things go and rested my hand on its spine as if checking a sleeping child's breath. In the drawer lay the postcard of the lighthouse I had never mailed to him, the twin to the one he was given. I left it there. Some correspondence is complete without stamps. If you are listening at your table, perhaps there is a cup cooling beside you and a list for the week waiting to be revised. Perhaps you have a small task that does not mind being postponed by the length of a sigh. The story will continue. Stories always do. For now, let us allow the sea to be where she is lessons upon lessons moving under a plain surface, and the boy to be where he is, somewhere inland, teaching his breath once again to be a good room. A week passed in the way weeks inside ministries pass, quietly, efficiently, as if time had accepted a position on salary. The file sat on the shelf with the calm of a finished thing, yet I found myself returning to it the way the hand returns to a pocket for keys already safely there. I told myself it was diligence. It may have been homesickness for a room where facts and grace had shared a bench without quarrel. One morning, the mail clerk set a thin envelope on my desk, the kind that makes sound by promising very little. The return mark was Mexico. Inside, a postcard of mangroves, green scribbles on blue, and 5 lines in a careful hand. "Sir," it read, "thank you for the compass. It points north even on my desk." The manual of my days is simple. I hope your son's barometer keeps its promises. Then, an elegant P, drawn small as a seal. I turned the card over and found he had added a single instruction to himself along the edge. Breathe, forgive, be kind. It is not our ministry's habit to file such items. I filed it in the left breast pocket of my coat and discovered that some archives are worn, not shelved. 2 days later, I went to Ueno Zoo. This was not indulgence, it was method. I stood before the tiger enclosure and read the placard twice. The way one rereads a label, hoping the Latin will explain appetite. The cat lay in the regal untidiness of big cats, chest rising with the effortlessness only experts achieve. School children pressed their mittened hands to the glass and argued about whether the animal was bored or thinking. Their teacher said, sensibly, "He is being a tiger." I thought of Pondicherry, of moats that are contracts, of a boy who knew that naming is not ownership. I did not say these things aloud. I kept them where they would do their work. Back at the office, our translation team sent up the draft of the Japanese language report we keep for our own records. They had, with their usual care, preserved what mattered and polished what pleased. In the final paragraph, they kept our line about 2 narratives with structural convergence. And this surprised me. They proposed one more sentence, placed with tea ceremony precision. We note that the story with animals is the better story. I smiled. The phrase looked at home in Japanese, as if it had been waiting there for us to notice. I initialed the margin. Chiba arrived at my door with a small box. "For your son," he said, and I could already guess. Inside lay a homemade wind vane, cut from stiff paper, mounted on a pencil that had retired from note-taking to a life of pointing. "Science fair bonus," Chiba announced. "Every instrument deserves a companion." We set the vane on my windowsill. It trembled, then decided. A secretary walking past laughed. "The building has its drafts," she said, and we gave them a job. Our work on the Tsimtsum case should have ended there. But a request came from the insurers for an addendum. Could we specify for their files whether the solar stills alone could have produced enough water under typical insulation? The tone suggested a polite doubt that might wish later to be an objection. Chiba, delighted, extracted from a shelf a binder titled Sunlight, as if he had been waiting his whole career to open it, and derived an estimate on scratch paper. We wrote, "Yield sufficient for survival when augmented by precipitation," then added, for their appetite for nouns, evidence of rainfall present in survivor's narrative and coastal meteorological logs. The clerk stamped it. The day exhaled. At lunch, I walked to the bookstore near the station. On a spinner rack, a paperback edition of a novel my son's teacher would call it canonical featured a ship in distress on its cover, sail torn to a dramatic angle. I set it back and bought instead a blank notebook with squared pages, the kind graph paper wears to work. In the first square, I wrote the sentence Pi had offered me like a tool. Respect begins where projection ends. Under it, smaller, fear gets a chair. A whistle on a lanyard bought in the camping aisle on a prior errand nested in the same bag. My wife would rightly ask why an engineer buys whistles on land. I would tell her that some sounds are rehearsed best before they are needed. The next week brought the sort of weather that narrows a city to essentials: cold, punctual trains, polite steam, rising from food. I walked home past the Sumida and watched ferries practice their art of indifferent generosity, leaving, arriving. An old man fed gulls by tearing his bread into exact thirds. A mathematician of kindness, he offered me a slice. I declined, and he looked pleased, as if refusal had confirmed the loaf's sufficiency. This is the kind of scene that prevents an investigator from becoming only a clerk. Pye's postcard found, without my asking it to, a place in my classroom when I visited my son for Parents' Day. The teacher had arranged the children's instruments on a table: barometer, hygrometer contrived from hair, a rain gauge fashioned from a soda bottle with printed scales. My son demonstrated the balloon skin dipping as pressure fell. "Air tells the truth," he said, and I nodded because one must encourage poetry when it arrives wearing a lab coat. I told him about the wind vane, and he promised to give it a job near the window that misbehaved. Beside his project, another child had built a compass from a needle and a magnet. The needle settled with such confidence I nearly said, "Amen." A cable from Mexico arrived with a query from a regional office. Would we confirm that, in our opinion, the lifeboat's sea anchor use aligned with best practice? We confirmed. Then I added, off-duty, a sentence the cable would never carry: that the best practice of the soul is to assign tasks to the day until the day admits it is navigable. I did not send it. I wrote it again in my notebook. But we still wonder whether our comfort with protocol tempts us to misunderstand mercy, whether a tidy ledger can forget the tremor in a hand that signs it, whether choosing the better story invites us to admire ourselves for our taste instead of to keep faith with a survivor's strange arithmetic. The sea, generous and uninterested, went on composing answers beneath ferries that never thought to look. To loosen this knot, 3 short domestic proofs. First, laundry. I watched shirts orbit in the drum and thought of currents cleaning is also a kind of drift, purpose asserted by a modest motor. Second, tea. I oversteeped, learned again that impatience has a flavour, and drank it anyway, because warmth is its own argument. Third, a cat not Richard Parker, only a city ambassador in stripes walked the low wall outside our building, looked in at me through the glass, and declined to be interpreted. He blinked like a metronome and continued, which is all a metronome ever asks to do. Chiba and I met once more over noodles to close the book, literally. He confessed he had reread the appendix of our report twice, searching for a place where the 2 accounts failed to rhyme. "They do rhyme," he said, "only in a key I don't know how to notate." I told him perhaps our job is not to notate, but to recognize the melody when it returns. He lifted his bowl in a small toast to modest mandates. That evening I stopped by a stationery shop and bought a rubber stamp no larger than the nail of my thumb, a small lighthouse. At home in my private notebook, I stamped it at the close of the page where I keep sentences that saved me from cynicism that day. Under the lighthouse I wrote, "He chose the ocean again." It felt right to mark a page with a light that does not move and a boat that does. Months later, this belongs here, though time will disagree, I received a second card. A pelican landing, wings out, feet indecisive. "Sir," it read, "I am learning to be inland. The prayer is shorter now, it still arrives. Please give my regards to your colleague who likes numbers and to your son whose instruments tell the truth. No signature, only the small pie again, this time drawn as if mid-thought." I returned the card to my coat and walked out into a city that had decided to be winter without argument. A woman steadied a stranger on the station stairs. No one wrote it down. Somewhere an elevator waited between floors for its assignment. Somewhere a boy finished his homework forgot to put away the pencil, and was forgiven by morning. I stood beneath a sky that refused drama and felt, not insight exactly, but alignment, the sense that north exists whether or not one looks. At home, I set the compass my son and I share on the table. We watched its needle for the pleasure of a decision well made. Then I opened my notebook to a fresh square and drew a small circle the kind Pi once drew to rescue a name. The circle met itself without applause. That is enough. Late winter loosened its fist in the way Tokyo knows by letting sunlight behave a little longer on stone. I had intended to leave the Tsimtsum file untouched, yet work has a way of inviting itself back in the form of envelopes. One afternoon, the receptionist placed on my desk a letter forwarded from our consulate in Toronto. The sender introduced himself as a writer, not with arrogance, only with the tidy hope of a man who believes pages can be arranged into shelter. He had met Mr. Patel, he said, and was preparing a frame for the account. He inquired whether he might, with discretion, quote from our interview not the raw tape, only the sense of what had been said. He wrote the phrase "better story" and asked whether we had in fact used it in our conclusion. I read the letter twice. Then I set it beside the postcard with mangroves and the little P, as if the two documents could keep each other sensible. I walked to the window where the wind vane Chiba had built for my son performed its slow spelling of weather. There is a comfort in instruments that do not ask to be dramatic. We like to think truth prefers trumpets. But the truth I meet most days wears a monotone and eats at its desk. Protocol said, answer with brevity. Courtesy asked for something larger. I drafted 3 versions, one that merely confirmed the facts, one that refused in case of policy I had missed, and one that answered the writer's letter rather than his request. In the last I said, as plainly as I knew how, that the report accepted both accounts, that the animal narrative honored protocol as surely as the human sequence, and that, yes, in the private vocabulary of decent men trying to conclude a thing, we had called it the better story. I refrained from explaining why. Some reasons shrink under gloss. I signed the formal letter that satisfied policy and slipped the informal note, unasked and unsigned, into my drawer. Not everything we know must travel. To clear my head, I walked to Kiyosumi Garden, where pathways understand their assignment and stones volunteer to be bridges. Near the pond, a child practiced with a whistle, the kind sold with a ball that refuses to rattle until the lungs insist. The boy's father showed him how to blow short bursts. Signal, pause, signal. I smiled at the familiar pattern, at how rescue drills visit afternoons with no emergency in them. On the bench nearby, an old man folded a page of graph paper into a boat and launched it with a ceremony that seemed to satisfy both paper and pond. It drifted with a seriousness I associate with small things done well. Back at the ministry, a trainee team had asked for a seminar on narrative reliability in survivor interviews. The phrase made me laugh, so many nouns chained together, each hoping to be the master. I prepared a session that taught what I actually trust, lists that keep a day upright, objects that become citizens of a crisis, tarpaulin, sea anchor, solar stills, flares, mirror, whistle. And the twin courtesies of mind, skepticism and attention. I drew on the board a lifeboat, a raft and the line between them. Call this distance, I told the room, call it mercy. I watched the faces do the work of learning a silence I recognize as the right kind. We practiced with transcripts from old cases, one voice excited to decorate, one voice careful to spare details that fetch the wrong dogs. I asked the trainees to mark where protocol appeared, not as jargon, but as habit. Checking gear, assigning tasks, rationing, prayer as metronome. Facts like these, I said, are load-bearing. Let them hold. Then I told them about the temptation of a tidy chart, how neatness reassures committees and can, if unexamined, disguise brutality. Make your charts, I said, but leave room for what does not consent to boxes. A hand rose. Sensei, how do we know when to believe the beautiful version? I answered with Pai's loaned clarity. Respect begins where projection ends. And second, I added, notice whether the beautiful version keeps discipline. Beauty that shirks work is advertising. At midday, I ate onigiri by the window with Chiba. He reported that his cousin's boy had built a rain gauge from a soda bottle and now judged the neighborhood by millimeters. A useful tyranny, I said. Chiba nodded, then grew uncharacteristically quiet. I dreamed the island, he confessed. Only, in my dream it was made of papyra floating library. At night, the books turned to salt. He smiled at his own indulgence. Even my doubt wishes to be poetic. I told him I had almost mailed a stranger a letter I had no permit to send. So, he said, we are cured by discretion. We clinked teacups. In the afternoon, I rode the train to a shipyard classroom where cadets practice panic under supervision. A trainer welcomed me with the brisk kindness of those who keep the sea at a working distance. We stood beside a lifeboat model perched on a cradle. He demonstrated the sea anchor, the simple altar at which physics receives its due. It only slows you, he said, but sometimes slowing you is saving you. I touched the grommets along the tarp edge, counted them as if the number were a prayer bead, count I had been entrusted with. The trainer blew a whistle 3 times, crisp. Cadets moved with an obedience that looked to me like music that has chosen understatement. He handed me the whistle. I blew once soft, like a man practicing courtesy on a new language, and all that happened was air returning to itself. That, too, seemed right. On my desk the next morning lay a telex from Mexico acknowledging receipt of our acceptance, dual register and protocol observed, with a side note from a junior officer who had added, recklessly, in a government cable, I like the tiger. I did not correct him. Love is not a cargo line item. The ministry's shelves will suffer the extra weight. My son brought me the wind vane report he had written. Rough diagrams, a paragraph about prevailing winds that read like a boy teaching himself to be precise. I like it best, he said, when the arrow takes a second to decide. I told him the pause is where truth checks its shoes. He did not understand. He liked the sentence anyway. That evening we sat at the table and ate tangerines, lining up the peels into a crescent that, seen from the right angle, resembled a lifeboat. He asked, unprompted, whether the boy from my case felt scared at night. I said yes, but he gave fear a seat. My son nodded, as if deciding where on our small table fear's chair should go. He placed it between salt and soy sauce, respectful, practical, then excused it because dinner needed the space. I did not write that down. I kept it. But we still wonder whether our preference for the better story risks making us curators of comfort, whether we gentle the sharp edges that ought to stay sharp, whether mercy can coexist with accuracy without one stealing the other's lunch. The ocean, if asked, refuses the debate and continues to compose tides that do not vote on themselves. Perhaps our task is only this, to learn their rhythm well enough to row without pretending we made the moon. I answered the writer at last. The official letter said what officials should say, that he may refer to 2 narratives, that he might, if he wished, include a note that the investigators preferred the account with animals for its coherence and discipline. I included no tape, no transcript, only the permission of a sentence. Then privately I placed on his envelope a small lighthouse stamp, the personal sort a clerk will ignore and a writer may notice. Let it stand for my wish that light find the page where it is needed. That evening in the bath, where men in our city allow steam to be eloquent and conversation to be optional, I thought of Richard Parker at the edge of mangroves, not turning. I had believed once that farewell requires a face. I see now that sometimes departure, done cleanly, pays a deeper courtesy. A student might ask what principle this illustrates. I could say territory, respect, the dignity of intact borders. The bath hissed like a long exhale. I decided to let the sentence remain unnamed. On my way home, the station pianone of those civic kindnesses that allow public music was being played by a woman in a blue coat. A child stood beside her and held the sheet music down with both hands, as if wind were the enemy. The piece was simple, a melody that repeats until the heart agrees. Commuters slowed one notch. I stood beside the gull-feeding old man from earlier days. He no longer had bread. He tapped the railing in time, and we pretended not to be moved. At my desk, I opened the notebook where I keep the day's sentences. I wrote, "Choose the story that keeps you most honest." Under it, I added, "smaller." And then, "keep choosing." I stamped the little lighthouse and closed the book with the satisfaction of a man who has given his own mind an address. Before sleep, I turned the compass my son and I share. The needle did its familiar hesitation, then declared north. I imagined a page traveling across a winter ocean. Toward a writer's desk, imagined another page, somewhere inland, with a boy's neat P at the bottom. I asked no more of the night than this, that both pages find their destinations without bending. Spring auditioned itself in brief rehearsals, light lingering on office glass, a looseness in the shoulders of coats, a softness in voices at crosswalks. I had meant to let the symptom case rest completed, archived, thanked. Yet, stories have a talent for reappearing as professional errands. A maritime college invited me to present a talk, From Flotsam to Fact, Notes on Survivor Testimony. The title sounded like a syllabus clearing its throat. I accepted, not because I had novel wisdom, but because the cadets would one day be the sort of people a frightened voice calls first. I began with lists. The classroom's chalk dust carried the old smell of attention. On the board I wrote the small republic of objects that refuses to be romantic: tarpaulin, grommets, sea anchor, whistle, mirror, flares, fishing kit, survival manual, solar stills. I drew a lifeboat, and slightly behind it, a raft tethered by line. "Call this distance prudence," I said. "Call it mercy if you prefer." Chairs shifted, pencils angled downward, in that posture of note-taking that looks like prayer. I spoke of protocol as a language the sea will sometimes consent to understand. One cadet sharp, courteous, asked about truth. "Sir, when two versions arrive, how do we avoid choosing comfort over accuracy?" I resisted my habit of turning a question into a different question. I told him what Mr. Patel had taught me: respect begins where projection ends. Then I added, check for discipline. The version worth trusting keeps its chores rations, signals, prayer as metronome. The sea anchor tended even when fear shouts. I saw comprehension arrive not all at once, but in the increments an engineer trusts, bolt by bolt. At the break, a cadet approached with a worn paperback of a famous shipwreck novel, spine cracked into enthusiasm. "May I?" he asked, and I signed my ordinary name on an ordinary title page while we both pretended something ceremonial had occurred. He said his grandmother fed the neighborhood cats. "One of them is almost a tiger," he said, and we laughed at a boy's lovely imprecision that, for a breath, felt like shelter. That afternoon, back at my desk, a courier delivered a small brown envelope from Mexico City official, but softened at the corners by travel. Inside, a photocopy of the final acceptance page bearing signatures that looked tired even in facsimile. And this startled my second page, unofficial, that someone had slipped in. On it, a local clerk had typed a short note. Please inform the survivor, villagers kept the lifeboat's whistle for their school. Children learn signals now. I pictured a courtyard and the bright disorder of recess, a teacher's hand raising that orange-tipped sound, the chorus of 3 short blasts, pause, 3 short blasts. In the margin I wrote a sentence no committee requires. Hope is a skill set. Chiba appeared with 2 cups of tea and a scowl he reserves for spreadsheets and poetry. Insurers want a footnote on insulation rates, he said, disgusted by the romance-killing word. Already sent, I replied. He brightened, pleased that an argument had been won before he entered the ring. We traded updates. His cousin's boy had now added a windrose to the classroom window. My son had mapped prevailing winds with arrows that looked like a flock, mid-decision. We sat in companionable silence, apprentices to steam. That evening I stopped at a small temple on my walk home. I am not diligent about shrines, but spring and gratitude have their own liturgies. A woman rang the bell with an economy of motion that held a whole grammar of respect. I placed a coin in the box, not as transaction, but as a way of giving weight to a wish. I wished for nothing dramatic, merely that voices like pies always find 2 good listeners and a table that does not wobble. On the way out, I bought from the stall a sheet of graph paper the monk had cut into bookmarks and stamped with a tiny lighthouse. For navigating words, he said. I believed him. A letter waited at home, the writer in Toronto, the one who had asked about our phrases and thanks, and mentioned he was placing the narrative in a frame that begins with a meeting in Canada. I pictured our hospital room's pale walls, the nurse's small empire of competence, the weak winter sun practicing its rectangles, and I felt an odd relief. Frame is a better word than box. Boxes confine, frames honor by attention. I wrote back the only advice I had earned: let the tools keep their names. Tarpaulin should be tarpaulin, sea anchor should be sea anchor. The sea is suspicious of euphemism. Work resumed its habit of pretending to be only work. A conference asked for a paper on latent failure in ordinary weather. I wrote what men like me always write, that calm logs do not exonerate materials, that routine is not proof of virtue, that fatigue is the slowest vandal. Between paragraphs, I remembered Pye's sentence about good days. Sunrise arrives anyway. I wanted to arrive with it. I did not quote it. Instead, I turned it into a safe line. Daily protocol reduces noise. This is how we smuggle mercy into memos. The weekend brought 3 domestic proofs I now keep like magnets on a refrigerator. First, my bicycle tire went soft. My son and I patched it in the kitchen, soap bubbles seeking the puncture like curious fish. Listen, I told him. It tells you where it hurts. He pressed his ear near the valve and nodded with solemn usefulness. Second, the vending machine returned exact change with a chime that felt like applause. We bowed to a machine and did not feel ridiculous. Third, a neighborhood couture unofficial ambassador liapped to the wall, considered us, and departed without a glance. We named him nothing. Naming would borrow something we had not earned. On Monday, a museum curator asked if I would consult on a small exhibit about Pacific currents. They had acquired a drift bottle glass, message intact, launched from a freighter decades ago and found near mangroves. The message was banal coordinates, date, a company name that had married another, and become a different registry, but the bottle itself preached its own sermon. That evidence can travel patient and whole if the sea consents. I advised on the chart, resisted the urge to add violets to the blue, and asked that the label include the word benign for currents that, while indifferent, are not malicious. The curator obliged. Language, when exact, is a tiny amulet. But we still wonder whether our affection for forms can trick us into believing that what is signed is what is lived. Whether attaching the word accepted to a narrative absolves us from the work of continuing to listen. The sea, asked to adjudicate, stayed busy teaching plankton to glow and flying fish to hurl themselves into metaphors we must handle carefully. Perhaps the better question is smaller. Will I, the next time, sharpen a pencil and make room? In the mailroom, a padded envelope without a return address arrived, addressed to me in a careful hand. Inside, wrapped in newsprint, a child's toy compass plastic, bright, the needle as eager as a dog. No note. I set it beside the cheap one from the hospital gift shop and felt, absurdly, the comfort of redundancy. 2 needles, 1 truth. My son, when I showed him, said, "Now the table knows where north is, even if one of us forgets. At month's end I travelled to Kobe for a safety audit and, after a long day of clipboards and steel, I walked the harbour at dusk. A ferry pulled away no romance, only schedule, and the wake practised its collapses. On a bench a young couple shared a bun and an argument conducted in smiles. I decided the subject was trivial and worth the trouble. A pelican oar, a cousin in the family of large, awkward grace landed and then, embarrassed by its own certainty, took off again. I heard myself whisper, 'You did fine,' and hoped the bird enjoyed praise that did not understand species. Back in Tokyo, Chiba brought soba and the news that his cousin's boy had won a ribbon for measuring rain. The ribbon was green, the color of fields and good jealousy. We ate with the contentment of men who have learned that hunger is not an emergency when companionship behaves. 'Do you still prefer the first account?' he asked. 'Not to reopen a case, but to take its pulse.' 'Yes,' I said, 'because it keeps work and keeps wonder.' He nodded, as if this answered a different question he would not ask. At my desk I opened the little notebook and stamped its page with the lighthouse. Under it I wrote 2 lines. Better is not easier. Dignity is a protocol. Then, smaller, give fear a chair, not the table. The sentences looked like tools laid out on a cloth clean, ready, loved. That night I dreamt a plain dream, a room like our hospital room, an empty chair beside a bed, on the windowsill, 2 compasses, on the tray, a whistle, under the bed, a manual, by the door, a pair of sandals dried by sun. No tiger, no hyena, no declaring. Only a boy's voice from the hall, saying he would be right back. When I woke, I felt neither loss nor relief, only the sense that a good report ends like that. With an open door and the promise of return, even if what returns is only the day. A month slipped past in that urbane way months acquire, when the calendar is pleased with itself, holidays squared, meetings aligned, trains consenting to be on time. The Tsimtsum file had found its shelf and behaved, yet I kept noticing small doors the story left ajar. I decided not to force them shut. Instead, I let air move through. An invitation arrived from a seaside town north of Tokyo, a seafarer's memorial ceremony coupled with a safety workshop. The letter was understated, names of those lost printed on one side, a schedule of dry talks on the other. I went. On the morning of the memorial, the breakwater wore a fringe of white. Gulls studied the ceremony with the professionalism of officials. A priest recited names, each falling into the air like a bolt placed gently in a tray. People bowed toward a lighthouse that needed no introduction. I found myself repeating, silently, a boy's inventory: whistle, flares, sea anchor, tarp, manuala litany not meant for worship, but for steadiness. After the speeches, I gave the workshop in a municipal hall that smelled faintly of floor polish and patience. I drew the usual lifeboat and its raft on a whiteboard and wrote beside the line that tethered them, "Room for mercy." A fisherman in a neat cap lifted a hand. "When panic comes," he asked, "what tool is first?" The room leaned toward the question. "A task," I answered. "Any small task that keeps your hands teaching your mind." He nodded as if I had returned a borrowed object. At lunch, an elderly woman pressed into my palm a paper crane, folded from graph paper squares still visible on the wings. "For navigating sorrow," she said, smiling as if the phrase were an old family joke. I placed the crane in my notebook beside the page where I had stamped a small lighthouse. Paper understands fellowship. On the train back, I reread the writer's latest note from Toronto, a courteous paragraph that said his frame would begin, as frames sometimes do, with a stranger knocking at a Canadian door. He asked if I minded being a character in someone else's arrangement. I tried on the idea and found it neither flattering nor intrusive, more like discovering your coat, once donated, has found worthy shoulders. I wrote back the only sentence that felt clean. "Keep the tools by their names and the courtesies by their work." He answered with a single line: "Thank you, I will try to arrive with the sunrise." It was not mine to approve, but I liked it. The next day I visited a shipyard training pool where cadets practice capsize drills. The instructor, cheerful tyrant of safe discomfort, invited me to sit in the bobbing raft while a squad rehearsed the right kind of shouting. I watched their hands do what hands do: check buckles, find the painter line, count heads. One cadet, pale with effort, blew the whistle in 3 short, 3 long, 3 short for his own satisfaction. The instructor let him keep the indulgence. When they hauled themselves in, one boy lay panting and grinned at me. "Sir," he said, "it's easier with a story where a tiger watches you do it." We laughed together at the truth beneath the joke. Attention is a tool. At home that evening, my son stood at the window with his wind vane and barometer notes, awarding the sky a B for effort. "Can I tell you a thing?" he asked, the way children pad their seriousness. "When I'm scared, I make a list in my head like you told me Mr. Patel did. Check, say the prayer, drink water, breathe." He shrugged, newly nonchalant. "It works. We ate rice with pickles. The cat not ours. The neighborhood's democracy appeared on the wall and remembered not to adopt us." A slim envelope from Mexico waited on my office chair next morning. Inside, a school's newsletter photocopied crooked with a photograph that belonged to 100 towns, children lined under a flag, a teacher with a whistle on a cord. In the margin, someone had typed in Spanish and then translated for us. "We teach signals on Wednesdays." The picture was ordinary, which is to say, decisive. I placed it beside the mangrove postcard with the small P. If an archive can be a shrine, a desk can be a small, good temple. Chiba arrived with soba and a fact he carried like a prize. The insurers had adopted our phrase dual register in a bulletin. "Miracle," he said dryly, when a bureaucracy accepts a hyphen. We ate in silence, warmed by salt and steam. "Do you ever worry," he asked at last, "that calling it the better story turns us into gardeners pruning what should grow wild?" I took my time. "Yes," I said. And then I remember he kept discipline: the chores, the rations, the sea anchor. Wildness without work is a performance. His wonder worked. Chiba exhaled as if releasing a knot. "I will steal that," he said. "Please," I replied, "pay me in noodles." That weekend I took my son to a diver, to the Maritime Museum's small room, where drift bottles twinned their secrets. A curator had labelled one current benign. My small contribution survived in print. My son pressed his nose to the glass, as if the bottle might fog in companionship. "Do messages get lonely?" he asked, perhaps only half joking. "Less so," I said, "if someone is practicing how to receive." He nodded toward the placard. "We're receiving." I bought him a toy compass plastic, enthusiastic, and we spent an hour turning small circles into north. Back at the ministry, a trainee stopped me in the corridor. "Sensei," she said, "is there a sentence I should remember when I forget what to believe?" I wanted to hand her a gadget, something with a battery and a light. Lacking that, I offered a sentence that had been ferrying me. "Choose the story that keeps you most honest, and then keep choosing." She wrote it down as if it would behave, and perhaps it will. But we still wonder whether the preference for honesty can hide an affection for consolation, whether our love of frames is only fear of the raw edge, whether naming something benign absolves us from noticing when the same current turns. The ocean refuses to assist with such anxieties. She continues to employ plankton as scribes and flying fish as punctuation. She lets us name what we can and forgives us the rest. To loosen the rope a little, 3 small scenes. First, the vending machine in the ministry's basement returned my coin 3 times and then accepted it with the embarrassed chime of a person caught being stubborn. Second, in the lobby, a janitor steered his mop with the gravitas of a helmsman bringing a ship to berth. The floor shone with the kind of cleanliness that does not require applause. Third, I misbuttoned my coat, discovered it 2 stations later, and decided some errors are acceptable when the train is warm and strangers are kind. That night, unable to resist the habit of arranging light, I opened my private notebook. On a fresh square I wrote 4 small lines, more for the hand than the archive. Respect begins where projection ends. Give fear a chair. Dignity is a protocol. He chose the ocean again. Beneath them, smaller, I added, and then he chose shore. In bed I listened to the apartment's polite sounds, the radiator practicing patience, someone upstairs rehearsing a scale, a neighbour's kettle announcing it had kept its promise. I thought of Richard Parker, stepping into mangroves without asking to be understood, of a boy laying his weight on sand, of villagers whose kindness arrived without adjectives, of a ministry room where 2 narratives kept rhyming across a table. I realized the story had given me a new superstition. Whenever I see a lighthouse, I imagine a small circle drawn at the base and a boy's hand steady enough to write it, even while tired. Tomorrow I would begin drafting a final lecture for the cadets, 15 minutes of what I have learned and what I still cannot say. I would tell them about lists and lines, about rafts and rooms for mercy, about the difference between control and order, about faith as rhythm rather than argument. I would not tell them how to choose between 2 beautiful truths. I would only ask them to hold both with the same grip they use on a rope, firm, not white-knuckled. Outside, a wind arrived that did not require our opinion. The compass on my desk made its small, brave decision. I slept with the contentment of a man whose pencils are sharp and whose questions know they can afford to wait 1 more night. Spring completed the quiet business of becoming itself. On my desk, the Symptom file kept the posture of a finished task. Inside me, the story continued its smaller errands, tightening a knot here, leaving a door ajar there. The Maritime College asked for a closing address. 15 minutes, they said. I prepared 15, then 20, then tore the pages and began again. The right endings are not decorations, they are bearings. I brought to the hall my old props, the list of objects, the tarpaulin, the grommets, the sea anchor, the whistle, the mirror, the flares, the fishing kit, the survival manual, the solar stills. A chalk sketch of a lifeboat with the small raft in tow, the line between them labelled without apology, room for mercy. The cadets sat with the alert patience of people who will soon be trusted with midnights. I told them what I tell myself. That order is humbler than control. That assigning a task to panic is a kinder first aid than shouting at it. That prayer, whether addressed to a god or to the discipline of the day, is a metronome more than a speech. A hand rose. Sir, if we ever stand where your survivor stood, what should we remember first? I could have said the sea anchor, and I nearly did. Instead I said, remember that fear is a thief when left at the door. Give it a chair. They laughed the short laugh of recognition. Then they wrote it down, as if a chair might fold and ride easily in a pocket. Afterward I walked to the harbour and let the ferries explain departure without saying a word. A boy fed gulls in exact handfuls. A woman in a blue coat tucked a newspaper under her arm, the way one secures a chart before wind. On a rail, a cat performed the ancient experiment of balancing grace and indifference. It succeeded. I bought a tangerine at a kiosk and ate it beside the water, peels spiralling into a small geometry that looked, from a forgiving angle, like a boat. Back at the ministry, a last envelope waited. Toronto, the writer's neat hand, steady as a good compass. He thanked us and said his frame was complete. A book would one day carry the boy's voice. He hoped he had kept the tools by their names. I read the letter twice, folded it once, and let it rest atop the mangrove postcard with the small P. The desk, I decided, had earned the right to be an altar. But we still wonder whether choosing the better story ever risks pampering our longing for beauty, whether in preferring tigers we neglect the harder nouns, whether faithfulness is measured by accuracy alone, or by the mercy with which we hear accuracy spoken. The ocean-patient teacher, indifferent witness, kept her counsel and continued to practice tides that respect neither footnote nor flourish. In the weeks that followed, life performed its proofs. The vending machine downstairs refused my coin twice and then accepted it with a chime that forgave us both. The janitor steered a mop through the lobby like a helmsman guiding a rival. The floor shone with an unadvertised dignity. My son adjusted his wind vane, watched the arrow pause and said, "It's thinking, we let it." I began, without formal permission, to close the case inside myself. I visited Ueno Zoo one last time, stood before the tiger's enclosure, and read the placard again, Latin elegant as a bell. The cat breathed. A child pressed her palm to glass and said, "He is not looking at us. He is looking at his thinking." Her teacher smiled and allowed the sentence to stand. I did too. That evening I prepared my final memo for the cadets, a page and a half that owed more to a hospital room than to a conference table. I wrote, "Respect begins where projection ends. Dignity is a protocol. Give fear a chair. Keep chores, rations, signals, prayer. A chart is helpful. Leave margin for weather. Choose the story that keeps you most honest and keep choosing." I stamped the bottom with a small lighthouse. The ink dried without drama. The last 500 words must go slowly, the way a boat learns to enter a harbour without bruising the pier. I woke early and found the city apprenticed to quiet. Steam rose from the kettle like a patient sermon. I set 2 cups on the table, one for the person I was when the file arrived. one for the person the file had introduced me to. Outside, the light rehearsed itself on stone. The compass on my desk did that brave little tremble before deciding north. I walked to the river. A thin wind put a fraction on the water. The ferries drew their white-sleeved lines and folded them tidily behind. I thought of the manual with its cheerful tone and sudden correct advice, of the solar stills making drinkable hope one cup at a time, of the whistle rehearsed by children on a Wednesday, of the flares that must be saved for the moment when saving means now, of the sea anchor that saves by persuading speed to be less of itself. I thought of mangroves, of sand that accepted weight without ceremony, of a boy who learned to measure the day with verbs and to let nouns keep their tiger names. I returned home by the longer street so the morning would last. On a wall, our neighborhood cat paused and did not interpret me. A bicycle's bell enunciated its small grammar of caution. A bakery released the community of bread into air. I bought nothing. Sometimes receiving is an act done by the lungs alone. At my desk, I opened the private notebook and turned to a clean square. I drew a circle's old rescue and set inside it a single word. Thanks, not for miracles, for protocol and courtesy that kept company with fear without marrying it. For the way two stories, held parallel, guided a careful train. For Richard Parker, stepping into mangroves without teaching a lesson he did not owe. For the villagers whose kindness arrived uncaptioned. For a nurse who knew how to lift a cup. For a colleague who loved numbers enough to translate them into mercy. For a son whose barometer taught him to believe air. I took from the drawer the toy compass someone had mailed and set it beside the cheap one from the hospital gift shop. 2 needles, 1 truth. I imagined a table inland where a writer was arranging chairs, and a page at last receiving a voice it had waited for. I imagined a classroom where a trainee, on some future Wednesday, would blow 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, and mean the oldest human prayer. I am here. Hear me. The phone rang. It was my son asking whether we might go watch ferries on Sunday. We can make lists, he added, conspirator to the last. We can, I said, we will. After we hung up, I laid my hand on the Tsimtsum file's spine as one checks a sleeping child's breath. The paper sighed the way paper does when it consents to rest. Evening found me on the balcony. The city's windows stitched a careful constellation. The air carried dinner and radio and the modest music of plates. Somewhere a piano practiced the slow courage of scales. I closed my eyes and listened for water that was not there. The ear hears what it has learned to trust. I will end as I began, with paper that has tasted salt without touching water. A dossier arrived, a boy spoke, a tiger did not look back. 2 accounts rhymed without touching, and a room learned how to hold both. If you have listened this far, perhaps you have your own sea anchor. Now a habit, a prayer, a list. Perhaps you have a whistle no one else can blow for you. The night is mild. The needle steadies. The light on my desk is the right size for a gentle harbour. I will turn the page and leave it blank, not as abandonment but as invitation. Because stories, like tides, are faithful in their returning, and because some doors are meant to stay a little open. And if in the quiet after this you find yourself wondering which story to keep, choose the one that keeps you most honest and most kind, then keep choosing softly again and again. The sea will not correct you. She will only breathe, and we, lucky to be on shore tonight, can listen.